Kamen Rider movies, the things that everyone hypes up and then immediately forgets about. That may be an over-exaggeration, but how often are the movies brought up when reminiscing on past series? But have no fear, because I shall be ranking almost every Kamen Rider film. It also serves as a good way to celebrate 50 years. I'll be counting every movie up to Reiwa the first generation, since I haven't seen 0, 1, or Saber yet, so their respective movies won't be counted. I mean, it wouldn't be fair for me to review a movie without having seen the episodes for them, now would it? Also, to clear up confusion on what counts as a movie, movies are anything that airs in movie theaters, no duh. So I won't be counting any of the TV specials, so no Set Cross or Tokijo vs. Gaim for example. To help break up the large amount of movies, and also save me a lot of editing work, I will be breaking up this series into 4 parts. Part 1 will consist of the very bad movies, Part 2 will consist of the bad movies, Part 3 will cover average movies, and the last part will have movies I consider to be great. Well, I'm expecting to piss off a lot of people. Might as well get into it. With such a large selection to choose from, you may think it would be pretty hard to guess what movie would be at last. But if you've been around the community long enough, you know the reputations that the Taisen films have. And with that, you already have a good idea of what film it's gonna be. And wow, would you look at that, it's Kamen Rider Taisen. Yeah, this film lands at the bottom of this list. To start explaining this mess, let's start by going over the story. The whole plot revolves around this kid named Shu, who has the power to reverse anything. Badon wants to kidnap him and use him to reverse Earth with a world inside the Earth to swap the living and the dead because they're evil. While I'm glad that Badon is being used instead of Shaka for the upteenth time, their plan is just built on plot convenience. Their entire plan is reliant on Shu having his magical power, but they weren't even the reason why Shu gained his power in the first place. So ultimately, it's just sheer coincidence that they found the person they were looking for. Also, it turns out that his father Ren is Kamen Rider 15, and he's working with Badon to kill everyone on Earth because it'll make my son happy. I'll be blunt, the whole Ren and Shu subplot didn't really entice me. It was boring, predictable, and was the cause for most of the logical gaps in this film. Not to mention that the only reason Shu got his power was because I want to reverse the damage I caused with my mother before I died, which is just a stupid reason. There are also some plot holes in this film, but the main reason this film lands at the bottom is because of its treatment of the characters. Kota doesn't do much except learn what it means to be a Kamen Rider, even though he should already know what it means to be one from Wizard's special finale. Shotaro, Tsukasa, and Ryo are just there for fan service, but now we get to the more problematic characters. Takumi in this film feels like he regressed in his character development, now believing he has no purpose in life, when the ending of Vice showed that he now had a purpose to live. Not to mention, Kusaka's retcon death heavily impacting Takumi in this film felt a bit off. Keisuke's introduction scene has him acting like a complete jerk by him taking down an entire police force who were just trying to capture a wanted criminal, which is then followed up on him attacking Takumi once he realizes he's a Heisei Rider. Finally, we get to Takeshi. I hate what they did to him and the rest of the Showa Riders. They turned them into a symbol of spite and callousness. They fight against the Heisei Riders because their feelings for the dead revived Badon and caused everything, which is not only a stupid reason to fight against each other, but also shows how hypocritical they act in this film, since almost every Showa Rider's backstory is rooted in death and tragedy. Sure, them fighting against each other does turn out to be a trick, until it's not, but the plan itself was stupid. They'll all turn each other into lock seeds, don't even ask how that's possible, so when Badon launches their final assault, Gaim will somehow revive them all so they can all fight together? Why didn't you guys just team up from the very beginning? Even the fights were just subpar at best, with the riders seemingly just making up the outcomes. Let me tell you, Kabuto losing against Skyrider is bullshit. In the endings, good lord, did they really have to reteach Kota and Takeshi the power of friendship in the most contrived ways possible, even though they should already know this stuff? There's a lot more wrong with this movie I could go on about, but I think I've made my point pretty clear. It doesn't have a good plot, the villains are bland, and the characters are either pointless to the plot or treated with disrespect. The next movie is another Taisen movie. Get used to them. It's Taisen GP. This film is only slightly better than Kamen Rider Taisen, mainly because it doesn't disrespect any of the returning cast to that movie's level. Though, instead of not understanding how to write any of the returning characters, this film doesn't understand any of the lore from previous shows. The entire plot revolves around Kamen Rider Sango somehow being built at the end of the original series and defeating Takeshi and Hayato, resulting in a timeline where Shocker rules to the present day. While I'm sure many of you could point out the war issue in that sentence, I'm going to address story issues after I've talked about the characters in this film.
Shinosuke doesn't really do much except for warning that Shocker is actually bad. Who would have thought? Kiriko is the only one who has memories of the old world because plot convenience, and that's it. There's really nothing else to her in this film. While it's cool to see the returning writers, such as Tachibana and Yuto, they really don't do much of anything either. They're essentially just glorified cameos. There are also a bunch of kid characters that this film tries to focus on, but it didn't work out so well. Spoiler, you'll find that most of the films that mainly feature kid characters usually don't rank that high. Finally, we get to the main star of the movie, Kamen Rider Sango, Koichiro. His character was bland and his development was equally as generic. His entire arc was wanting to fight for justice, but in the most convoluted way possible. You see, Koichiro only cares about victory because he believes that history justifies the victors, and if he loses, that would mean his act of murdering Ichigo Niga was wrong all along. But, after losing against Shinosuke, he learns that losing can actually help people grow, and from there, he decides to fight against Shocker. Can you see why this character doesn't make much sense to me? Speaking of Shocker, they're just there. Not much I can say about them other than their plan is pretty stupid. They want to erase Kamen Riders from history, despite already having conquered the world for over 45 years. Now we get to the plot and, oh boy, there are so many lore misconceptions and bad writing choices. Let's begin with the obvious flaw. Gel Shocker was the villain group at the end of the original series, not Shocker. Shocker was even thoroughly disposed of by Gel Shocker grunts when they first came into the series. Other things include stating Takeshi and Hayato escaped through their own willpower when in reality they escaped due to the help of others. Most of the writers wouldn't have existed to be later brainwashed if Shocker had taken over the world back in the 1970s. Kotaro turned into Black RX despite his Kingstone being destroyed and being under rubble, which would have blocked the sun from even reviving him. He also somehow has Rideron, despite Rideron only being created when Kotaro built it from the blueprints he got from the Demon World, which he wouldn't have been able to do in this film. Kiriko commits suicide for no reason. Go is somehow against Shocker while also being friends with Shinosuke, who was a devout Shocker follower before the movie even took place. Takumi acts like he's completely apathetic towards everything, which contradicts his original character. Takeshi and Hayato reveals they were alive the entire time, which basically means they did nothing but watch for 45 years as Shocker conquered the entire world. Overall, this movie is just bad. The story has numerous plot holes and overall feels very disjointed. The characters are either bland or, once again, not treated correctly, and Shocker just felt boring and had no impact on the story. While this movie isn't part of the Tyson franchise, it is written by the same writer who penned all of them. Let's Go Kamen Rider has pretty much the exact same issues with Tyson GP. Characters that don't do or have much to them, a villain group that doesn't have that much of a presence, numerous plot holes and lore misconceptions, and an overfocus on kid characters. There is one, and only one reason why this film places above Tyson GP. Seeing Shotaro and Philip back on screen. No joke, that single scene hypes me up more than the entirety of Tyson GP. Regarding the other characters, AG doesn't really do much in this film, but I will note that him essentially telling a child to execute his own death sentence because he should save his friend seems very out of character for him. I get the whole shtick with AG is to reach out to anyone who you can reach out to, but this just takes that to an insane degree. Ankh doesn't do much either except be the entire reason why the plot starts in the first place, and Kotaro and the Tars are just there to waste time for their comedy. Now, there's one reason that all these characters were pushed to the wayside, so we can over-focus on dumb kid characters. Naoki and Mitsuru are pretty much the central characters of the plot, so if you dislike them, well, tough luck buddy, cause they aren't going anywhere else. And these kids are absolutely atrocious. At least 99% of the movie's problems are directly related to the actions of these kids. AG's left powerless for a while at the beginning, because one of the kids stole his metal book. The villains get their hands on a cell metal, which they somehow used to take over the world, because the kids started a ruckus that resulted in cell metals getting left in the past. Teddy's forced to stay in the past, leaving Kotaro defenseless in the present, because one of them decided to stay back in 1971 for no reason. And these kids aren't ever punished for their actions, but in fact rewarded for it because the only reason the day was saved was because that kid stayed in the past, which led to Takeshi and Hayato being freed from Shocker's brainwashing. Oh yeah, I should probably talk about the plot. Well, when I said this movie had the same issues as Tyson GP, it's mainly because this movie has almost the exact same plot as Tyson GP. Shocker manages to defeat Takeshi and Hayato through some time shenanigans happening, resulting in a timeline where Shocker has taken over the world. The Rider shenanigans happen, and then big fight scene at the end with all the Riders coming back. However, this movie's story is even more disjointed than GP's. It feels like the production staff were just making up the movie on the fly, resulting in a movie that has multiple story and lore issues. To list some examples, Imagine somehow goes into the past by using Mitsuru's most important memory, which is actually a memory from his own future. General Black is somehow part of Shocker, despite being from Geldom. Shocker manages to team up with every other villain group, despite most of them having conflicting interests with Shocker. Shocker somehow finds a mysterious new core metal which can form a greed with only one cell metal needed. Both General Black and Takeshi somehow create a fake cell metal in literal seconds. The Den-Wan are being completely fine despite exploding not even 5 minutes ago. Takeshi and Hayato somehow defeat the Shocker Greed despite losing it to the last time they fought. Every rider loses to the Great Leader just to make the Tamashi combo look good, and more. However, my biggest issue comes with the reveal that Takeshi and Hayato were only pretending to be brainwashed by Shocker. Sure, they were probably only freed around 1991, when the kid was old enough to free them, but that means they spent at least 20 years furthering Shocker's conquest of the world, all for the sake of waiting for the perfect time to strike back. Yeah, remind me when a Kamen Rider has purposely let evil subjugate, torture, and kill thousands, if not millions of innocents for decades, all for the sake of waiting for their chance to win. This action just goes against what Kamen Riders stand and fight for, and it's not just this film that has this problem with representing what Kamen Riders stand for. Both Kamen Rider Tyson and Tyson GP have this issue to some degree. Though like I said, seeing Shotaro and Philip transforming was cool, and seeing the writers come together to fight in the end was pretty great, but the awesomeness of those scenes were just drowned out by the rest of this garbage film. Now, we're back to the Tyson franchise with Cho Superhero Tyson. Watching this movie felt like getting my life sucked out of me. That's how bad it was. The only reason it doesn't rank lower is because it doesn't disrespect any of the characters in an atrocious way. Still, this film barely felt like a Superhero Tyson film, but rather Kamen Rider Tyson with some Sentai characters. The Sentai cast barely do anything important in this film and just feel like cameos. Hell, only one of the Key Rangers got any focus despite being the concurrent Sentai along X-Aid. The main characters in this film really don't do anything, they just feel like cardboard cutouts of their TV counterparts. The only character I found interesting in this film was Hiro, but his whole arc in this film was tied to the worst part of the film, but I'll get to that when I get there. The villains are once again Shocker, and they want to rule over the world, so we can pretty much ignore them because like the movies before them, they had nothing of interest to the movie. The story is both terrible and empty. There are many elements that seem like the writers just made up on the spot, which really just takes you out of enjoying the film, not to help that most of these elements were connected with the worst character in the film, 8. If you don't care about 8's story, well too bad, because 8 is the central focus of the entire film. To help you see why I hate this character, let me inform you of his entire role in the film. So, 8 was diagnosed with a disease that, I'm not even joking, slowly digitized his entire body. To presumably save himself, he created the game Cho Superhero Tyson and then escaped into its game world. Then, somehow, he manages to bring enemies from games like Xevious and Galaxia into the real world, forcing the heroes to defeat Cho Superhero Tyson in order to save the world. However, it turns out this was all part of 8's plan, because it would unlock the secret stage that would allow Shocker to wreak havoc on reality by reviving them. Why would 8 do this? It's because I forgot to mention that the dude was also born without emotions, and he wants to destroy the world because he doesn't care what happens. Then, through the power of friendship, he learns that what he's doing is actually bad and then decides to live in the real world. Do I need to explain how contrived all these elements sound? And to make matters worse, Hiro's entire arc in this film is connected to this kid. He feels guilty for not saving 8 because it tarnished his perfect record, but then realized that he wasn't in the wrong, 8 was, because 8 refused to be operated on. Hiro doesn't even grow from this, and the audience knows that Hiro wouldn't let this get to him, since we know as a fact that his policy as a doctor is not to operate on someone who doesn't want to be operated on. For as terrible as this movie was, there was one shining moment, the character select sequence. It was great seeing all the actors interact with each other, even if they don't do much later. It's a shame too, since the tournament aspect of the film was genuinely interesting. This film would have been better had they just removed 8's entire story and stuck with the tournament for its central plot. That way the movie wouldn't feel like it's condensing 3 things into one, but alas, we are left with this unfortunate mess. Moving out of the Yonemura movies, we get to the first Inui movie on this list, Kamen Rider the First. If watching Cho Superhero Tyson felt like my soul getting sucked out, watching the first felt like that, but 100 times worse. There was nothing left in me inside after I watched this film. This has got to be one of the slowest and most empty Kamen Rider movies in existence. The plot is very, very bare bones. I won't lie though, the first third of the film was genuinely interesting to watch. mainly because it explored how Takeshi dealt with the consequences of his new powers. However, that all goes down the drain when Inoue decided to employ his favorite trope, adding in love triangles for no good reason. The last 2/3 of this film are dedicated between the love triangle of Takeshi, Hayato, and Asuka. Is this a Kamen Rider reboot film, or a tween drama film? The characters aren't even that entertaining to watch. I already mentioned Takeshi's interesting conundrum, but after that, all we get from him is a bland, goody two-shoes hero. Hayato's made even worse. They took his original character of him being a hot-headed yet amiable guy into a jerk with a heart of gold. Then we get to Asuka. She's just there to fulfill two of Inoue's most famous tropes, being a love interest and causing misunderstandings. Even though the first third of the film was interesting, it was bogged down by the subplot of Asuka thinking that Takeshi killed her boyfriend because Takeshi doesn't even bother to explain what actually happened. It's not until the hour mark for the issue to finally be resolved. Back to the story, there are once again many elements that just feel contrived. Takeshi regains his humanity because water crystal artsy bullshit. Takeshi doesn't need any blood transfusion because he's already a perfect cyborg, despite Hayato being remodeled after Takeshi and suffers from that flaw. And Asuka chooses Takeshi in the end despite knowing her thought-to-be dead boyfriend is actually still alive. In Shocker, they're just there. Not much else I can say about them. There is one good thing I can attribute to this film. It's the subplot between the sick patients. But even then, it wasted time since it focused on two irrelevant characters instead of developing the two main characters that needed it the most. Despite being a reboot of the first Kamen Rider series, it feels anything but one. I don't have any creative segue here, so I'll just say that it's Superhero Tyson Z. Or Z if you want to call it like that. This movie had an interesting concept, but man, it executed it disastrously. The whole plot once again felt like it was being made up on the spot, with new elements being added and dropped left and right. We'll create magic portals all over the universe, and we'll eventually create the largest magic portal to teleport some giant castle onto Earth, so that we can use it to spread the Genmu dimension throughout the universe and destroy it. Like, okay, sure, why not? The villains are Space Shocker, so Shocker with some word behind it. Yeah, get used to seeing a bunch of Shocker variants that exist for no other reason than we needed nostalgia to play a factor in selling our movies. However, the characters are the worst part of the film. They're either written so you either don't remember them, don't care about them, or just hate them. The entire Wizard cast barely does anything, Guy's there for humor, and Yoko and Psycholian are just there to evoke emotions in the audience whenever something bad happens, which means it doesn't work. Hell, Psycholian is just a giant plot MacGuffin that ends up feeling unimportant because its entire point was to activate the giant castle thingy to destroy the universe. But when Psycholian is removed, the castle still works for some reason, so what was even the point of him? Finally, we get to Geki and Retsu. Geki was decent as a character, but the dude was hot-headed and an idiot. Like, yeah, tell the two people who can transform to stay behind while he investigates the enemy base alone without any powers. Retsu, what did they even do to him? They legit just turned him into the secondary villain in this film. I'm not even joking. At the start of the film, he immediately suspects Haruto and Nito for causing the portals to be opened across the universe because they are magic users, and has no other proof besides that. He also genuinely believes that killing them is the best course of action, and even revokes Geki's ability to transform when he refuses to kill both of them. And then later in the film, he just decides to blow up Earth because there's no other option. Like, holy shit. Is this really what Retsu was like back in Space Sheriff Gaban? For as much as I dislike this movie, it does rank higher than everything else, mainly because there were more interactions between the three series that I enjoyed. However, that's its only positive. I want to make it clear, I really wanted to like this film, but I couldn't. Heisei Generations Forever is, in my opinion, the film with the worst plot out of every single Kamen Rider film. Character-wise, Sento and Soko barely get any focus. Sure, Soko has this moment of existentialism, but that doesn't even last for a minute before he goes back to the bland hero he is. Everyone else felt unimportant because all the screen time went to two kid characters. Yeah, it's nice that they basically represent us fans, but my issues is that they're tied to some of the more incomprehensible parts of the film for me. Tid is a terrible villain. He wants to destroy the Heisei era because it's the last Heisei movie and we need some villain to tie into that. His personality is non-existent and his whole plan is just filled with issues. Finally, we get to the plot. Good lord. This movie made me want to bash my head in with how confusing, incomprehensible, and annoying this writing was. Nothing in this film makes sense if you actually put some thought into it. Okay,
So the whole thing of this film is that Kamen Riders are actually a work of fiction, and this kid, Ataru, is the cause of bringing Kamen Rider characters into reality. The issue is that he does this using an Imagine, and besides the fact that I don't think Imagine have the power to literally manipulate universes, this contradicts the statement that Kamen Riders aren't real, since both the Imagine and TID originate in reality, despite both of them hailing from Kamen Rider series, Den-O and Geo respectively. To put shortly, there is no clarification on whether Kamen Riders were always fiction or part of reality, which is an issue when that's the main focus of the film. TID's entire plan revolved around becoming another Kuga, which would somehow erase Kamen Riders from history, or reality, even though they weren't part of reality because they were just a TV show. Unless TID becoming another Kuga made Kamen Riders nothing more than a fictional TV show. But Shingo states that Kamen Rider Kuga was going to air on January 30th, implying that it was always going to be a TV show? Does this mean that TID was just trying to erase the TV franchise from existing? But Riku exists in reality, so does that mean Kamen Rider was going to be like a reality TV show? Great, now my head's spinning. Oh yeah, not to mention the other unexplained details, such as why Shingo was so important to TID's plan. Yeah, at first it's implied that he can somehow activate TID's giant tower that he somehow has, but then it turns out that he's important because he comes from an era where Heisei Riders don't exist yet, and combining with TID somehow makes another Kuga more powerful. Also, how in the world did Ataru not even notice that Shingo looked like his older brother from the picture in his own house? We also get the marvelous scene of the Kamen Riders coming into reality because people remember them, even though Shingo knows they exist and has remembered them his entire life. So why are they only now appearing in reality? Because Shingo acknowledges that they're real now, despite having known them? God, this film just infuriates me like nothing else. Sure, I should have probably just turned my brain off and enjoyed the film, but I'm unfortunately not like that. The only reasons why this movie doesn't rank any lower is because I genuinely like the mystery in the opening section, and seeing Takeru Sato come back as Ryotaro was nice. Still, this was a terrible movie to celebrate ending the Heisei era of Kamen Rider. On the topic of Den-O, our first Den-O movie is up next. Yes, the series that has the most movies out of any series, 8 movies. For reference, Gaim had 7, but 4 of them were only 30 minutes. Den-O has 8 one-hour movies, which is very impressive. Now, Onigashima Warship is the worst Den-O movie, mainly for how many elements it pulls from previous Den-O movies, and using them very poorly. There are 2 demons that need to complete the MacGuffin of the movie, the Kirifuda, in order to unlock the Onigashima Warship to take over the world. The liner crew find out about the plan, some time travel shenanigans happen, and then they stop it. That may sound like a massive simplification, but honestly, that's all the plot there is to this movie. Ryotaro and the Taros don't really do much unless you want to say padding the movie with comedy counts, but I don't. Despite being the second film to feature Kotaro, he does nothing as well. The villains are probably the worst Den-O movie villains out there. I'd wager that even if you watch this film, you don't even remember their names or who they are. They're demons that come from the past and they want to rule the world. That's all we get for them. Finally, we get to Yu, who is the movie's exclusive character. He's a young brat that has had a tragic life up to this point and wants to escape into the past to avoid it. However, the film immediately drops that entire character point for him and instead turns him into a goody two-shoes with a heart of gold. It's only at the end where they bring that original character point to make it seem that Yu developed. Also, the big twist? It's that he's Sakurai Yuto's younger self, which adds nothing to Yuto's character. The storytelling just feels like the writer gave up writing Den-O movies and just added stuff into it to see what works. At the beginning of the film, Yuto is mysteriously vanished from time and the Taros are scattered throughout time for some reason. Then the movie ignores that entire plot point for the rest of the movie. I'm not even joking, it's never even explained what caused those things in the first place. Additionally, this movie has the dumbest scene I've ever seen in Kamen Rider. They somehow trick the villains into believing they have traveled through time using nothing but drawings and fake props that they somehow all got and set up in a couple of minutes. I get that it's supposed to be comedic, but this is comedy at the expense of making everyone look dumb. Not to mention that this scene is very dragged out. There are also other storytelling issues I have, but to summarize, Onigashima Warship just feels soulless. There's very little to the characters, villains, and movie plot. It tries to focus on the comedy instead of the story, which just results in the interesting plot points and possible expansions on characters getting pushed to the wayside. Also, the team-up with Decade was minimal and pointless at best. Speaking of Den-O and Decade team-ups, our next film was Episode Yo of the Cho Den-O trilogy. I apologize for repeating myself, but this film is just terrible. It's another plot with time travel, but at least it tries to be interesting. The plot revolves around Daiki trying to interfere with an event that his past self was involved in, but then the shenanigans with the Weiner crew dilute this simplistic plot until the movie becomes irritating and annoying. As you can probably tell from my tone, Ryotaro and the Taros don't add to this film at all and actually hinder it in my opinion. Daiki is an interesting case. While he does retain that cockiness of his, I feel like he's oddly nicer and kinder than he usually is for some reason. I mean, he can be a nice guy at times, but mostly he's just a dick to others. How come in this film he wants to help someone completely unrelated to him? Sure, it's because this treasure may not be important to me, but it's important to somebody else, but that just sounds out of character for what we know of Daiki. Reiji is the movie's exclusive villain. He hates humans, and then he doesn't. That's his entire character and arc. Eve is even worse. It's an AI that goes crazy at the end of the film because we need a villain to be defeated at the end of the film. The storytelling is awful. I've already mentioned how padded this film is with pointless scenes for comedy, but they introduce a bunch of things out of left field, namely the Time Police, an organization we've never heard before or since this movie. There's also the issue of Daiki's motivation throughout the film. Sure, he wanted to help Reiji, but the film also presents him as him wanting to steal the Den Rider to steal time. It's like the writer couldn't think of a good way to hide Daiki's true motivation, so they just made him flip-flop between them, which doesn't help when you look at his actions throughout the film. There's also the fact that Daiki, out of nowhere, gets handed the DNK touch by Reiji. Is it ever explained why the Time Police had this? No. Still, for as much as this movie lacked, it is saved by Daiki being a badass at the end of the film, but that's the only reason it ranks this high.
Now we get to the next film. Get it? The next? As in Kamen Rider the next? Haha, I'm so funny. I didn't like this movie. Now, take the first, but replace all the love triangle related stuff with horror, and that's essentially this movie. It only ranks higher because I found the horror more interesting than a love plot, but this film is still extremely slow, with underdeveloped characters and villains. First of all, both Takeshi and Hayato seemingly regressed in their complexity from the first. Takeshi is now more meek than ever, and also seems to no longer be seeing Asuka, since she is not even mentioned once in this film. So great, the entire love triangle from the first film we spent nearly over an hour on is now completely pointless. Hayato is now a playboy, and that's it. He also dies at the end, but who cares? His entire character is wasted in this film. You'd think that Shiro Kazumi would play a pretty important role in this film, but he doesn't even do much until the final act of this film. Also, despite being a reboot version of V3 Shiro, this version has even less personality than his Showa counterpart. All he cares about in this film is his sister and power. Shocker plays even less of a role in this film than in the first. Their plan is to turn everyone into cyborgs by injecting people with nanomachines, and they think this will somehow convince everyone to join Shocker? Yeah, I think they have a couple screws loose. But Showa Shocker has had some dumb plans before, so I guess that excuses it somewhat. Now, there's a reason why these important characters got so little screen time. It's because all of their screen time got pushed to the wayside to focus on a horror plot. Well, it wasn't bad, it just felt out of place for a Kamen Rider film, and essentially forced the big bad scary monster to be the final villain of the film, just to give a satisfying resolution to the horror plot. Speaking of resolution, the final act of this film was terribly organized, with a constant flip-flop of scenes between the horror plot and the Shocker plot. There are also some dumb storytelling choices, such as Shiro suddenly deciding to fight against Shocker because he thinks it's what his sister would want, and Takeshi getting another love interest for no reason. Still though, if you do like horror, I would say this film is just okay. However, this film feels like it's a Kamen Rider film in name only.
Now, it's time for the first Showa movie entry on this list. Five Riders vs. King Dark sounds like it would be interesting, but well, this film lies. They don't fight King Dark in this film at all. Aside from lying to the viewers, there is no substance to the plot whatsoever. Keisuke finds out about an evil plot, we jump cut from random fight scenes with the other Showa Riders, they all team up at the end, and then they win. I know I sound nitpicky because it is a Showa film, so I can't expect too much from this film, but I still feel like other Showa films had good elements to them, as you'll see later on. This film felt rushed and wasted many opportunities. For example, despite being the first instance we see of Rider-Man after his supposed death, we don't even get dialogue between Shiro and Joji that shows that Shiro's surprised that Joji's still alive. This film is just a massive disappointment for what could have been one of the first big team-up movies for Kamen Rider. Returning back to the Den-O train, Up next is Final Countdown.
時間の波を捕まえて
This film just feels bare bones. The characters, villains, and plot are all there, but they feel like they're just lacking something. Despite being the film to introduce Kotaro, I feel like I barely knew anything about his character by the end of this movie. He's introduced as a cocky brat, and then after getting knocked down a peg, he trains and then becomes a normal protagonist. I will say that his character could have been interesting, but this film just wasted it. The other characters don't do much either. The Taros are the central focus of the film, since Ryota pretty much spends the entire movie possessed by the villains. All they do is comedic stuff, not really doing much else until the end of the film. Oh yeah, Yuto is here. I forgot he even existed in this film because he literally does nothing. Shiro is the main villain of this film, and his goal is to resurrect his dead girlfriend by killing Ryotaro's ancestors, which will cause Ryotaro to cease to exist, which will cause a time distortion so great that it will make all the dead living again and all the living dead? Yeah, okay, sure, whatever. Correct me if I'm wrong, however, but isn't the whole point of a singularity point that they aren't affected by any changes in time, even if their past is messed around? Wouldn't this plan just not work? Shiro also has no personality whatsoever, being a regular brute that barely emotes. The only thing he ever cares about is his dead girlfriend, so he's basically just a sim. Finally, the story. I've already mentioned how stupid Shiro's plan was, but the rest of the story is just non-existent, filled with needless padding. Take away all the fluff and what really happens in this film. Ryotaro's been possessed by Shiro's forces, so the Taros go back in time to stop Shiro and save Ryotaro. After a big fight filled with emotional speeches, Ryotaro is saved and Shiro is stopped. Roll credits. Additionally, the final fight scene drags on for way too long in my opinion. Sure, it's mainly filled with Momotaro's making a speech about how much Ryotaro means to him, but I feel like that was already something that was done in Deno's finale, which was already copied from the episode where Climax Form was gained. So doing this whole symbolizing of Ryotaro and the Taros' bond felt a bit repetitive. Overall, this movie felt like it was trying to cover up how bare bones it was with a bunch of other things that tried to distract the viewer. The characters really don't have anything important added to them. Shiro is probably one of the worst movie villains, and the plot is just empty. If there is one good thing about this film, is that while I did find the speech Momotaro's gave was a bit repetitive, I still liked it. V3 vs. Destron Mutants is like a padded show episode. There's really not much plot, and there are some inconsistencies within it, but my main issue is with how repetitive it is. The entire movie is basically just 3 scavenger hunts that last for a total of 30 minutes, so yeah, not the best use of time. However, the biggest reason it falls so far is also tied to the best thing about this movie. While it's cool to see Shiro fight with Takeshi and Hayato, it doesn't really gel with the series' continuity. Shiro doesn't even react to them being alive and well, which conflicts with later episodes where Shiro's shocked to see they're still alive. Still, I can't knock this movie too hard, but man, it's pretty repetitive. Another Showa movie, and this time it's Kamen Rider X the movie. I mean, yes, this is just a regular episode, but it was rebroadcasted on the large screen, so it does count. The only things I dislike is how much it plays into Showa tropes. Keisuke learns the plan because the monster of the week said it out loud for a dumb reason. A child is being used as a hostage, and everyone thinks Keisuke's dead because he fell into a river, which happens twice in this film. So yeah, while I am disappointed in this film, once again, I can't really criticize these movies since they're just products of their time. Still though, at least it doesn't interfere with the continuity of X like V3 vs. Destron Mutants did with V3, so that's positive. Now jumping forward a couple of decades, we get to Kamen Rider Ghost: The 100 Icons. We go from disappointing and repetitive plots to probably one of the most confusing and underdeveloped plots in the franchise. There are a lot of mysteries that never get properly expanded on, causing the world building and story just feeling underdeveloped. To give a list of examples, what exactly is the Icon Island? Who created it? How come its only residents are luminaries? Why did it disappear when Argos died? Why did Senin give a ghost driver to Argos? Why did Senin teleport both Argos and Daigo to the Icon Island? How come Senin didn't use the luminaries from the Icon world to make the wish to the Great Eye himself? How come all the Icons that entered the Icon world gained human forms and also lost their memories? How come everyone in that village was an Icon despite the fact that Icons aren't part of spirits but rather an invention of Laganma?
Was Daigo really helping Argos for over a decade? And for what? How come Senin didn't even try and fight against Argos? Etc, etc. Though my issues with the story come at the very tail end of this movie. For some reason, this film introduces the concept that if Takeru's body is destroyed, Takeru cannot exist as a ghost, despite the fact we saw his body dissolve in episode 1. Sure, you may bring up that if a Ganma's host body is destroyed, then the Ganma dies as well, but the hosts aren't dead, they're just merely in stasis. Takeru's different, he's already dead. Later on, Takeru then manages to convince all the luminaries to break free from Argos by reminding them of dinner, which is pretty stupid. Then, when the film needed the obligatory revive Takeru stunt, he comes back because of magical spirit power, even though by the film's own logic, Takeru still doesn't have a body, so he shouldn't even come back. Speaking of Takeru, what was his entire character arc in this film? That he's sad because he can't have dinner, even though he can do everything else like a normal human such as sleeping, emoting, and feeling? Yeah, they tried to expand on him, but let's just say that was a major flop. It was a dumb idea to focus on dinner as a major theme of this film, since it's the sole reason why Takeru goes against Argos' plan to turn everyone to ghosts. Speaking of Argos, he's boring as hell. He's Adonis' oldest son, and that's it. He wants to turn everyone into ghosts because he's evil, yada yada. Though, controversial opinion warning, I think that Argos' plan to turn everyone into a ghost wasn't actually that bad of a plan, until he tried to sacrifice 101 wives to achieve it. I mean, think about it. Sure, you wouldn't be able to eat, but that would just mean you don't have to worry about dying of starvation or thirst. You also have the ability to fly, turn invisible, live forever, and a bunch of other perks. Plus, you still have all the aspects of a human, you just can't eat. I'm not saying that Argos forcefully turning everyone into a ghost is a good thing, but when Takeru's only reasoning as to why Argos' plan is evil is because it's wrong to prevent people from eating dinner, you're gonna have to convince me a bit more to fully put me on Takeru's side. Now, the other characters don't really get much focus either. Awan barely does anything, Necrom Trio just felt like a waste of time, and all Makoto really did was find out why his father abandoned him, which didn't even matter since Makoto understanding Daigo barely impacted his character at all. This movie is just a dumb film with a lot of trash. Stupid character development, terrible villains, and just a garbage plot. However, there are some small pieces of good stuff. Even if it was terrible, I respect the effort to try and expand Takeru in a new direction, rather than repeating stuff that was already shown, and that final rider kick is so beautiful. It is probably one of my most favorite movie finishers. Unfortunately, those aspects aren't enough to save this film. Well, now it's time to jump back on the Den-O train again, cause up next is Climax Deca. Seems that Den-O movies just can't get a break, huh? Well, just like Onigashima Warship, this movie lies about its team-up. The Kiva cast barely show up in the film, only relegated to a cameo and a fight scene together. Now, besides the big fat lie, this movie just feels like a watered-down episode of Den-O. All the characters really feel like they're just hollow shells of their TV counterparts. Ryoto was your typical meek hero, Yuta was the grumpy guy, and the Taros were funny. It makes all the scenes we spend with them feel charmless. The plot of this movie is also completely wacky, which is both the good and bad thing. While I wasn't totally against the whole detective agency thing, I feel like it was pointless in the grand scheme of things, since this movie doesn't really convey the whole detective vibe as well as, say, Double for example. I feel like the movie is just doing it for style, not substance. There are also some unexplained plot holes when trying to tie this film to the TV series, such as Yuto somehow having more Zeronis cards after running out in the finale, and more Emojins somehow appearing despite Kai's death getting rid of all the Emojins, except for the Taros. At least the story was consistent, plus the pacing was fine for the first half of the film. Then the film throws that all out the window by having a 30-minute fight scene that does absolutely nothing to raise the enjoyability of this film. Finally, we get to Negataros. He would probably be one of the more forgettable villains if he didn't have the ability to transform. Somehow. All he wants is world domination and his personality is just being a cocky jerk, so there's really not much to love about this dude. However, even if everything else just felt like a bare-bones episode of Den-O, the subplot with the movie-exclusive side character, Kazuya, was pretty good. His development from a timid and weak-willed cop to a courageous one was nice, even if it still felt pointless in the end. That subplot was the only charming thing about this movie. Everything else, yeah, no. Well, the last entry for part 1 is probably going to be very controversial. It's Kamen Rider ZO. I know, the fight scenes are amazing and the choreography and creativity for them are epic, but everything else is just bland. Masaru is probably the blandest rider protagonist in the entire franchise.
The film doesn't even bother to state his actual name, only giving it in a document that shows up for a couple of seconds in the film. He acts as a stoic yet helpful person, and that's it. So pretty much like most of the writers before him. Sure, we learned that he was an assistant to the professor that turns him into a Kamen Rider, but that's all we know of his backstory. The dude barely even emotes in this film. The villain, the Neo-Organism, or the Neonoid, or the Neo-Lifeform, whatever, is not a good villain in my opinion. Yeah, both its and Doros' appearances are cool, but like everything else in the film, there's not much else other than aesthetics. The Neo-Organism is just an insane brat that wants to genocide humanity because scientific creation becomes more powerful than its creator and tries to become God. Hell, why did Professor Mochizuki even create it in the first place? Just because he can? Speaking of the professor himself, the whole "he was actually a good guy the entire time" felt like a cop-out, given the fact that despite being the one who turned Masaru into Zeto, he didn't even bother telling Masaru that he needs to become Zeto to stop the Neo-Organism, and instead forcibly experimented on him without even explaining anything. You know, you'd think you would at least want to get his consent before irreversibly changing his life forever. Now we get to the plot and it's just a dumpster fire. The film rarely slows down to actually explain what's even going on or explore any of our main characters. It even opens up with a fight scene. It's not until the halfway point when we finally learn what's even happening. How are the viewers supposed to care about the stakes when the film doesn't even bother explaining what they are? Besides the god-awful pacing, there are a bunch of contrivances, coincidences, and things coming out of nowhere to force the story to move along or to justify something that shouldn't even make sense. It's like the scenes regarding plot are only there to set up the next fight scene instead of actually focusing on the plot. Now, the reason why this is the best of the worst are the awesome fight scenes, monster designs, and the kick-ass ending song. But everything else about this film is just a mess. It's like the film is trying to be an action reel rather than a proper movie with interesting characters, relationships, and villains. Well, I ended the first part with a controversial choice. Time to start this part with another one. Shin Kamen Rider Prologue isn't that great. The titular character Shin is almost as bland as Masaru from Zeto, but at least Shin has some glimmers of characterization and character development. Unfortunately, anytime something intriguing occurs that could challenge his character, the film just babies him and absolves Shin from having to do anything or change. Shin believes he's a berserk monster that has killed innocent humans and fears that he could eventually hurt the people closest to him. Could he grow and develop from this situation? Nope. After a 2-minute pep talk from his girlfriend, he just completely stops worrying about it. Plus, the reason for the visions he's been having? Turns out they were actually Gichi's action, and Shin was experiencing it through telepathy. Shin realizes the organization that he sacrificed his humanity and future for has been using him as a pawn for world domination. How does he react to this shocking revelation? He doesn't. He just sorta stares at his crying girlfriend and never thinks about the subject again. The side characters and villains are so bland that they can each be described with 1 or 2 traits. Ai is Shin's girlfriend, who also works with the evil villain group. Sarah is a CIA agent that's interested in Shin. Iwao is the leader of the big bad organization called Foundation. Goshima is his right-hand man, and Giichi is the crazy scientist. However, at least Giichi was interesting and genuinely pulled much of the weight in the first half of the film, due to his interesting philosophy and actions. Too bad he was killed off so we could have Iwao and Goshima as the final villains of this film. Bleh. Now the story.
It's so slow. Barely anything happens in this 90-minute film.
There's so much padding to the point where it's nearly insufferable. The first 30 minutes barely do anything to inform us about Shin as a character. Ai and Shin's relationship barely has any focus despite being one of the more prominent parts of the film. The scenes with the CIA feel like a waste of time. The random ass fetus showing up out of nowhere that has magical powers felt like it was shoved in at the last minute. Basically any scene that involves Iwao just expositing random stuff, and many more issues. Now, I understand that this is a prologue and was setting up the villains, story, and characters for the future, if Shin had had a future. But previous Kamen Rider series had much better first episodes that set up everything. V3, X, Amazon, Super 1, and Black are perfect examples of an introduction done right. However, the reason that this isn't a 1 out of 10 is because the story, while slow, was decent, and Giichi does raise up the cast of characters a bit. Plus, the film does have great special effects. Still, everything about this movie was a snooze fest. Well, it's finally time to say goodbye to this film franchise. Superhero Tyson is the best Tyson film, but even then, it's still pretty trash.
To quickly summarize the good parts, the story wasn't terrible, and the film did have moments where I was emotionally invested, mainly any of the scenes involving Joe. Now that all of the good things that I can say about this film are out of the way, let's dive into the trash, shall we? Our central cast of characters is Daiki from Decade, Hina from O's, and Joe and Doc from Kikaider. Meh is the best word I can use to describe them in this film. They don't do much, and the interactions between the four of them can be summed up as writers and Sentai shouldn't fight against each other. Daiki is probably the most interesting out of the entire group, mainly because of his sudden betrayal at the end of the film. I know that most people rag on Daiki in this film for that betrayal, but actually I kinda thought it fit with his character. I mean, after Tsukasa reveals everything up to that point was just a trick, a very emotionally manipulative trick, I can see why Daiki would want to take revenge in the most extreme way possible. Oh, speaking of Tsukasa, he and Marvelous are the quote-unquote villains of this film. Yeah, sure, Shocker and Zangief eventually usurped that role, but they're both completely pointless and forgettable. Both Tsukasa and Marvelous have pretty much the same characterization in this film. They hate the other franchise because they started killing us first. Now the story. Like I said, the plot is mainly dealing with Sentai and writers trying to kill each other because they started killing us. However, it then turns out to be a giant trick to fool the real villains so they can all join together for a big fight scene against them, which has got to be the second stupidest thing in this film. While you may think the whole killing each other was just a trick was pretty bad, don't worry, it gets way worse. There are many more plot issues that make this story even more terrible. As a disclaimer, I know that most of the story issues I'm going to bring up can be dismissed because it was all a trick, so why does it matter? But I feel like that's just a cop-out to sweep all of those issues under the rug. Alright, back on topic. So, this whole war starts off because Tsukasa/Marvelous killed Akaranger/Ichigo, but the film literally opens with Marvelous killing the 7 legendary riders, which is complete bullshit by the way, which would imply that Marvelous started this whole thing. There is no explanation as to why Zangief and Chaka revived, and they are written to act like complete wimps who can't do anything without Tsukasa/Marvelous leading them. Also, Marvelous is somehow able to go back in time alone, despite not having that power. According to my memory, anyways. But the stupidest thing in this film has got to be the revelation that the war actually started because one franchise can't survive if the other continues on. Now, what may sound so wrong with this? Well, it's referring to the quote-unquote fact that if Rider had never lost their time slot back in 1975, Sentai wouldn't have a time slot to air, and therefore Sentai would have never existed. So the entire motivation behind this war was based off a fucking meta-joke, a meta-joke that no one in the universe would have understand. Yeah, even though this film was pretty stupid all the way through, this film is saved by the character interactions, even if they were pretty disappointing, and any emotional moment with Joe. But god, this film was just idiotic. Well, another film that deals with a bunch of heroes. Except not really, since it wasn't the main selling point. Overquarters is disappointing. The writer basically just said fuck it, and threw in a bunch of stuff to try and make a comprehensible story. This film is pretty much split into 2 parts, the prelude and then the actual film. The prelude, or the first 23 minutes, is legit just all about Sogo gaining the Drive Ride Watch. Anything that happens in this part is never expanded upon. The importance of the cross, how Krim managed to talk to Sogo and the others, what Go was doing at Krim's residence, never expanded upon. The actual plot is dealing with this group called the Quarters, nice title drop by the way, and is ruled by the quote-unquote True Sogo. True Sogo wants to restart the Heisei timeline, and it's up to Sogo to stop him. Anyways, this film doesn't have the greatest plot. There are a bunch of issues with this plot I could go on about. The whole Sengoku era shenanigans that leave zero impact, trying to push the message of live the life the way you want, Heisei riders have monumental impact, and Sogo is actually a good king, all at the same time, just made the whole movie feel messy. There are more story issues, but that's mainly connected with the villains, so I'll talk about that when I get there. With the characters, Sogo does have some depression since he's discovered that basically his entire life was a setup and he's been stealing stuff from other writers, but once again, one pep talk solves all of these issues and Sogo goes back to how he originally was. Hell, he even needed to be reminded why he wants to be king, which is something he spouted since episode 1. Gaze and Tsukiyomi, they do nothing other than spout that Sogo isn't as evil as we thought, so we believe in him now. Waz is the most interesting character in this film. It turns out that he was a member of the Quarters and has been working with True Sogo this entire time. Then he eventually realized that he wants to be with Sogo because Heisei writers have tenacity or something like that. On to the villains and oh boy. Kagan and Jogen are pretty pointless in the grand scheme of things, however True Sogo is weird. He has no personality other than domineering, and the reasoning for his plan to reset the Heisei era is stupid.
He wants to reset it because he finds the Heisei timeline too messy and complex. Sure, this may sound like a dumb but okay explanation, but my issues are with the implications of this motivation. To me, True Sogo's entire character just feels like a derision of the fans who care about continuity in Rider. It seems like the staff just wanted to get back or poke at the fans who point out war issues in Riders by making a villain that basically represented them by having his entire motivation be due to the many different seasons of Rider contradicting each other, so I want to undo it all. I understand that Rider continuity is extremely complex and confusing, but especially in Geo, the staff just seems to take a mindset that people shouldn't point out continuities because it doesn't matter, and we're too lazy to conform to continuity, so we just make stuff up. Hell, this movie seems like it's trying to deflect any story issues by promoting the message of it doesn't matter, since this film literally ends with Tsukiyomi, Gaze, and Waz suddenly being brought back to life, despite the fact that they all just died. They even acknowledge that they have no idea how they were revived, but Sogo just responds that it doesn't matter. Even if you don't want to care about the continuity, you shouldn't have a villain attacking a part of the fanbase. Also, pointing out your own flaws doesn't automatically fix everything. However, there are some good parts about this film. There are some cool looking shots in this film, and I do like the attempt to have developed Sogo and Waz, even if they both failed in my opinion. But the poor plot, numerous unexplained details, terrible villains, and not utilizing the main cast well don't bring this film up any higher.
Now, we start our delve into another film series, the movie War films. While it was a tough call for which one would end up last, ultimately I decided that Genesis would take that spot. Even though Genesis was the first movie war to break away from the mold of splitting the films into 3 acts, the plot of this film really dragged it down. With regards to the characters, both Takeru and Shinosuke were alright. However, the film really doesn't do much with expanding them. Takeru developed by proxy of his younger self wanting to stand up for himself, while Shinosuke just had to gather the courage to propose to Kiriko. Now, you could probably infer that this movie deals with time travel, and that this element is the main reason why this plot sucks. Well, congratulations, you're halfway correct. The villains are a group of Ganma who want to rule the world because they're evil. They wreak havoc back in 2005, and it's up to Shinosuke and Takeru to stop them. However, because of the shenanigans in the past, the Roid trio have all revived and have also lost their memories, and for some reason are more evil and powerful than before. But at least Chase is revived, with all of his memories still intact for some reason. Yeah, these villains were pretty bland. The Ganma were generic, and the revived Roid trio just felt like a last-minute addition instead of feeling like they were actually incorporated into the story. Now it's time for the plot. You know how I mentioned that some of the movie's problems were caused by time travel? Well, another reason why this movie has so many problems is because the writer of this film has never worked on either Drive, Ghost, or Kamen Rider in general. So, when Shinosuke and Takeru arrive back in 2005, Shinosuke discovers Krim in a bush, even though the global freeze happened in 2014. Does this mean that Heart killed Krim all the way back in 2005 and then waited 9 years to initiate the global freeze? Why is Krim even at Daitenku Temple? Not to mention that this film kinda invalidates the most emotional moment present in Surprise Future, but that's a spoiler so I won't talk about it now. The Ganma are for some reason able to use heroic spirits, even though all of the Ganma beforehand were using inanimate objects as the basis to transform. Go and Makoto are unable to use the Ganma icons, but not because they can't use them, but because they don't know much about the spirits residing in them. Even though all you need is the spirit's approval, and even that can be overridden. Also, the reason why Shinosuke and Takeru were able to travel into the past? It's because Ryu somehow summoned them. Yeah, no, that's complete bullshit. Not to mention that this film later ends up contradicting Ghost's lore, since Ryu was killed by one of the Ganma in this film, when it turns out that he was actually killed by Adele. Imagine being so out of touch with the lore, that this film had to be declared non-canon just to fix it. So yeah, this film was a giant mess. The story had a lot of issues, and the villains were pretty disappointing. However, at least the story wasn't completely nonsensical, and there were some good emotional moments with the characters. Well, I had mentioned before that it was a tough call to decide which movie war film was the worst one, and up next is the runner-up, Ultimatum. Can we just ask Toei to stop having writers who have never worked on the featured Kamen Rider series to helm their movies? Like Genesis, the writer of this film had only worked on a short Black RX film and had never worked on Wizard. which is an issue since he's the main writer for both Wizard and the Ultimatum part of this film. Well, at least Heisei's part was decent. It was nice seeing the Kamen Rider Club reunite and having some wacky shenanigans with them. The only faults with this part is the villain Banba being extremely forgettable, and over-focus on a completely new character, Saburo, who did have a good arc, but kinda felt unimportant, Gentaro destroying his Heisei driver for a really dumb reason, and Gentaro's entire development being summed up as learning to become a better teacher by helping a student change for the better, even though the entirety of Heisei saw him change people for the better, even as a student. Now onto Wizard's portion. It's a real stinker. Haruto's doesn't really do much, and the whole plot was a bit confusing. Haruto's tasked with waking up a girl named Poitorine to stop monsters from escaping into reality. That may seem like a simple plot, but it's quite hard to piece together because this portion constantly jumps around without much explanation. For one, the underworld is no longer a dimension of a person's subconscious, but rather a realm underneath the earth, which is just stupid. There are also somehow multiple gates connected to the same underworld, and a person's underworld is treated like a dream instead of a memory of the gate's moment of despair. For the villains, they're the Akamizers, but evil. Ooh. I'll be honest, repurposing other Ishinomori heroes to be villains for the sake of fan service is not respectful in my opinion. Like yeah, turn old heroes into villains for the sake of promotion. I'm sure that has never led to anything bad happening. Dragon Force. The Akamizers as villains are kinda bland. They're evil because they're demons. They want to open portals to the human world so they can invade, yada yada. But why do they need to kidnap people? How are these monsters even created? In the person's underworld? This film just felt confused. Heisei's portion was the only saving grace, but even that wasn't the greatest it could have been. I know the issues I've stated don't seem that atrocious, but if you watch the full film, you might get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Or maybe not. Oh man, speaking of movies that don't treat past characters right. Yeah, the Ichigo movie, in my opinion, doesn't really portray Takeshi or the original 1971 series in the best light. I get what they were trying to do with Takeshi, but I think they just executed it extremely poorly. In this film, Takeshi is now no longer willing to fight against evil. Now, you could chalk that up because his body is breaking down and he's tired of fighting, but I would still say that it goes against his character. But the real reason he doesn't want to fight, it's because he doesn't want to make Mayu, who's Tachibana's granddaughter, sad and alone. Ugh. So, you take the symbol of self-sacrifice and heroism and basically turn him into a selfish boomer who's completely fine with letting evil run rampant on innocent people so long as the people close to him don't have to suffer because of it? Jesus, man. And the reason for him reverting in his character? So he could relearn the lesson that Kamen Riders fight for everyone. As if you needed to relearn that fact. Oh yeah, him being a boomer doesn't just apply to his reasoning of, I don't fight because it would make Mayu sad. He refuses to help Takeru fight against Nova Shocker because you shouldn't rely on me, and tells him that he'll only help if Takeru finds out why life is important. Even though I'm pretty sure Takeru spouted the importance of life in previous episodes. Takeshi acts like he assumes Takeru wants him to take care of Nova Shocker for him, but Takeru doesn't. He just wants assistance to take them down. And my assumption as to why Takeshi refused to help is because this film tries to present Takeshi as a lone hero, with no comrades and no one important in his life, which is why he gravitated towards Mayu, who is the only remnant of someone close to him. The writer does realize that Takeshi has had many allies over the course of his career, and has relied on countless others. This whole notion of he does everything alone is false. He has relied on Tachibana, Taki, the Rider Scouts, other Kamen Riders, and other allies. For Takeshi to seemingly forget everyone except Tachibana seems really disrespectful, and this lone hero notion, being the basis of wanting to teach Takeru to defeat problems on his own, seems extremely hypocritical, since once again, Takeshi has always had help and relied on others when dealing with problems. Oh, and the greatest thing about Takeshi trying to teach Takeru the importance of life and standing up for himself? When Takeshi is later revived in the film, Takeshi has no qualms with teaming up with Takeru to take down Nova Shocker without even asking if Takeru has learned to stop relying on others or discover the importance of life. So what was even the point of Takeshi refusing to help Takeru in the first place? Ugh, let's just get to the other characters. Like I already mentioned, Takeru tried to develop by learning the importance of life and to stop relying on others, but like I previously mentioned, he already knows the former, and the latter is a non-issue that never gets resolved. Mayu is just a giant plot device. She has the Alexander icon for some reason, and that's the entire reason why the villains are after her. Also, the fact that she's supposed to be the last important person Takeshi has feels really disrespectful, as I mentioned before. The villains are Nova Shocker and Shocker. Nova Shocker just wants to rule the world's economy, which is why they split from Shocker, even though Shocker was confirmed to be ruling the economy in the shadows in the original series. Shocker is back, and not Joe Shocker or Bodon, and Ambassador Hell is revived for some dumb reason. Bleh. At least Ambassador Hell has more characterization compared to his portrayal in the original series, but the other villains are just bad and pointless. Now the story. I've already mentioned a bunch of issues with the portrayal of Takeshi in this film, but there were other issues I've had. Early on in this film, there was a love triangle because it's Inoue writing this film, of course there needs to be a love triangle. Takeshi also has a new form for no reason, and despite the fact that his body is breaking down, it's more powerful than his original form. There are also a bunch of scene transition that leaves the viewers no time to digest what just happened, and at the end of the film, Takeshi is revived because of magical bullshit. Speaking of that revival scene, it fell off. It happens because Mayu wants Takeshi to come back, and then Takeshi comes back because everyone's hearts are connected. You know, you could have just presented his revival as multiple people wanting him to come back, or Mayu wishing him to come back to help others as a better way to convey the message that Kamen Riders fight for everyone. But no, it's the result of Mayu forgiving Takeshi and asking him to come back for herself. So yeah, this film in my opinion was a mess that completely botched Takeshi as a character. It felt like the film purposely backslided in Takeshi and Takeru's characters just to reteach lessons both of them should already know. The villains were boring and generic, and the story was filled with issues and wrong ideas about Takeshi. But even though I hate this film, I do like the attempt to develop these characters, and there were some emotional moments. But god, this film was just terrible. Well, I won't rant about this movie for that long, if you're worried that the last entry was anything to go off of. Well, this comment may be unwarranted, but I consider The Last Judgment to be the best thing from the Amazons franchise, but even this film wasn't that great. There was a lot of padding, mainly because most of the scenes were just dedicated to, oh, the cruel reality of humans eating Amazons because humans are at the top of the food chain, oh, the humanity. I mean, yeah, it fits into Amazon's message of whether it's right for Amazons to eat humans to survive, but the way this theme was incorporated in this film just led to a lot of fluff. Now with the characters, Haruka was alright, but felt he had no presence in this film. He also felt kinda different compared to Season 2. I mean, in Season 2, he was more connected with Amazons, but now he cares more about humanity than Amazons. Then again, this film does basically act as if Season 2 never happened. I mean, that is for the better in my opinion. The only major thing about his character was going against his moral to never eat someone, but after a reminder to always protect everyone, he just gets out of that real quick. Jin was kinda pointless, and also bad. All he really did was spout, I will kill all Amazons because redemption, and that's it. Now we get to the villain, Mito, and he's also kinda bad. He believes that humans are superior to Amazons, and that's it, and then he dies. The plot of this movie led to a lot of issues. Haruka's trying to stop a new scheme to breed Amazons for the sole purpose of slaughtering them for food. However, for some reason, these Amazons don't dissolve into black goop. Sometimes? Also, these Amazons, which are created from Jin's Amazon cells, don't hunger for meat because they're vegetarian and have never eaten meat before, so that's why they don't crave it. But shouldn't they still crave protein because they're created from Jin's Amazon cells? And while it does push the question of, is it right for humans to breed Amazons that exist solely for food, it never goes any further than just bringing up that question. Hell, the film never points out the numerous other animals we breed just for food, like cows and poultry. This film also ends on a cliffhanger and hinting at a possible follow-up, even though this film was heralded as the finale to Amazons. Overall, this movie felt bland and empty. The theme of is it right for humans to eat Amazons felt pointless since it shouldn't even be possible to eat the remains of a dead Amazon in the first place. Haruka didn't do much, and Jin did even less. Mito felt like he was just there because we need a movie exclusive writer, and the ending just felt inconclusive. However, once again, there were some good emotional moments, and I liked part of Haruka's development. Too bad it doesn't save this film. Well, I may have spoken too soon about not ranting for too long. Rebirth Spectre is, like expected at this point, a giant mess. Despite focusing on Makoto, I feel like this movie did nothing to expand on his character and personality, but rather just randomly reveal revelations about his past that come out of nowhere that add nothing to him.
Makoto's whole dilemma is discovering he's actually not human, but an artificial one created by Danton. This then causes him to freak out and become depressed, but then at the very end, he just seemingly accepts it. Why? It's because this film went from a theme of what does it mean to be human to accepting all my sins at the very end. Additionally, his depression was furthered because he believes no one will treat him as a human once they discover the truth, even though his friends have always treated him as one. It's not like they treated you as a human just because you were born human. With the others, Alon does nothing except gain a new power-up and immediately gets defeated. Takaru and the rest don't do anything either, just fill the film with random fluff. Danton is the main villain and he's just weird. The dude either acts like a lunatic psychopath or a loving father. One moment he's mocking Adonis for his ideals and threatens anyone who goes against him, and the next he deeply cares about Makoto and Canon and gives them helpful advice. It just makes his character feel inconsistent. His whole motivation behind his plan was disappointing too. At first, it seems like he truly wants to help the Ganma people by creating a perfect world, and will do anything to save them, even if it means performing human experimentation. But at the end of the film, that just gets dropped in favor of God Complex, since he reveals all he wants to do is just to prove his way is correct, and anyone who disagrees with him must die. Now the story. Ugh. First off, Copy Makoto got retconned to not be a side effect of the Deep Spectre icon, and instead being other versions of Makoto. However, this then means there is no explanation as to why Makoto and Copy Makoto were mentally connected to each other. Saionji is reintroduced only to die for no reason, and Gyro is just killed off for no reason. However, the biggest issue I have with this film isn't with the story, it's the actions of the heroes. Yeah, you heard that right. So, the entire reason why Takaru and the others tell the Ganma residents not to follow Danton and try to stop him is because modification is wrong because it takes away your humanity. Here's the thing, this franchise has always associated modification with loss of humanity, but that's because the original Kamen Riders were rebuilt to be nothing but weapons. But even despite being remodeled, Takeshi and Haito still had their humanity with them. While they weren't filled with flesh and blood, they still cared for others like a normal human being. Let's take Blade for example. Even though Kanzaki may have lost his human form, does that mean he's lost his humanity? And if you argue that Kanzaki did sacrifice his humanity to save the world, then does that mean Hajime never had humanity in him to begin with? What about the Roidmudes, the Bugsters, the Taros, Philb, Ong, Kenko, and many other characters? Do all of these characters not have humanity simply because they weren't born with flesh and blood? To me, Heisei Kamen Rider, especially Phase 2, tried to redefine humanity as not just someone being born of flesh and blood, but rather a mindset. To be kind towards everyone, no matter their race, gender, or what their body is made of. To give hope towards others, and to protect those they care about. If our hearts and goals align, is it fair to say that one is not human simply because they aren't made of flesh and blood? That's why I'm actually okay with Danton's plan. I don't condone him forcefully experimenting on other humans just to complete his research, but now, he's just leaving it up to the people, and all he's doing is remodeling their bodies just so they can live in the hostile Ganma world. He's not even planning to corrupt their minds. Yes, Argos had the same plan, but Argos also forced that decision upon everyone else. So for everyone to go against Danton because being remodeled means you won't be human, in a franchise that has constantly proven that humanity isn't just defined by what you're made of, it feels oddly backwards. Yeah, sure, this ends up not mattering since Danton ends up being revealed as an insane person who does need to be taken down, but the point still stands since this was the reason why everyone is against Danton for the majority of the film. So yeah, overall, this film was just off to me. Makoto didn't really develop meaningfully since all he learned about was his origins. Danton was an inconsistent villain that ended up being cliched, and the story had plot holes and things that didn't really resonate with me. Still, at least there were some good character moments with Makoto, and I did like some of the shots of the film, especially anything that features Sin Spectre. It's a shame he was only shown twice. Well, after that long rant, it's time to talk about another movie that focuses on Blue Rider. Episode Blue, The Dispatch Imagine is Neutral, I have no idea what they were going for with that title, is a movie solely dedicated to Kotaro and Teddy. That's a good thing, right? We can finally learn about Mr. Cardboard and his sidekick. Well, unfortunately, this movie does not do anything to actually expand on either of these characters. The film sees Teddy being stripped away from Kotaro because Teddy's contract has run out, which doesn't even make sense given that none of the other Taros even have contracts, but whatever. Then we spend the rest of the movie with both characters going, "Wah, I miss my partner." Teddy suddenly dies, but then he comes back because the power of friendship. So great, another Den-O film dedicated to showing the bonds between the Taros and the contractor. Sure, Kotaro says he becomes more independent, but the film never even shows him becoming more independent. And Teddy? He does nothing.
Well, so much for having hopes that this movie would actually make me like these characters more. Also, the villain? It's just a random Imagin with nothing special about it. Great. And the story. Oh boy. Once again, this film has a lot of stuff that either comes out of nowhere or contradicts the lore of Den-O. Teddy seemingly has a timed contract, meaning he has to switch owners every so often, and if he decides to leave his new owner, he could die. Yeah, where did this element even come from? Oh yeah, Teddy's new owner in this film? It's Owner. And he suddenly acts like a complete dick for no reason. Hell, he doesn't even have a reason for suddenly wanting Teddy to cease his contract with Kotaro and start working for him instead. Another thing is that a contract ticket, for some reason, is treated as granting the user the ability to time travel, even though it's only used to guide the Den Rider to a destination in time. Now, there was one good thing about this movie that I liked. Too bad it didn't have anything to do with what was actually happening. The subplot of the film is about this mysterious case of a girl named Miku, with two of them suddenly appearing at the same time. It turns out that one of them is actually from the future, who wanted to spend time with her grandmother since she died in the future. While this subplot had really touching moments, it unfortunately did nothing to connect with the actual stuff with Kotaro and Teddy, besides sharing the message of always cherish the time with your loved ones because you never know how much time they have left. So overall, this film was just boring, with the only memorable part about this movie being the subplot with Miku. Everything else was repetitive. Why did we even need a movie focusing on the relationship between Teddy and Kotaro when we barely know anything about either character? It would have been better had this film focused on their first meeting. That way, we would know their character and relationship better. Oh well, too bad I can't change the past. Now it's time for the show of films to take the spotlight now. We'll be blazing through these next films quite quickly. Starting off this trend is Kamen Rider vs. Shocker. This is basically just a standard episode of Kamen Rider, but with a slightly bigger budget. The plot's forgettable, nothing much happens with the characters, and the villains are bland. Yeah, this criticism pretty much applies to most Showa movies. However, what makes it so terrible is the big bad plan Shocker has. They want to use a device to sink Japan to the bottom of the sea. Yeah, how are you gonna rule over Japan if it's SeaWorld? Also, why in the world did the scientists create such a deadly device that has no beneficial use? Still, these movies are harmless, which is why it doesn't fall into the 1 out of 10 rating, but that doesn't mean they're good. Now it's Black's first movie, Hurry to Onegaishima. Plot, boring. Character development, non-existent. Villains, stupid. Now onto the unique stuff about this film that makes it bad. This film feels like they started in the middle of a regular episode of Black. There's no build-up, no explanation of what's going on, we just immediately start with Kotaro searching for some dastardly Gorgon mutant. Oh yeah, and to make up for skipping the build-up, they just extend every fight scene by like 50%, so great, now I'm both bored and confused. And Gorgon's plan is just actually stupid. They want to turn Kotaro into a mutant, so they lock him up until the perfect time occurs, completely ignoring the fact that they have the perfect opportunity to take back the Kingstone. You know, the thing that they have been constantly after for the entire season? But still, this film feels more cohesive than Kamen Rider vs. Shocker, and the cameo of Shotaro Ishinomori was cool, which is why it earns enough brownie points to rank above Kamen Rider vs. Shocker. Now it's Black's second film, Terrifying, The Demon House of Devil's Pass. So, why is it better than Hurry to Onegaishima? Well, it's because this film actually has a proper beginning section. Plus, it had a fight between Kotaro and Shadow Moon, even though they don't do anything meaningful besides that. Too bad Shadow Moon's plan is actually pretty dumb. He plans to build a giant robot in Yubari because Yubari has a lot of energy. The reasoning behind why Yubari has a bunch of energy? It's because the name means Land of Spring Water. Alright. Not much else I can say about this film. I'm running out of creative ways to introduce these films. Kamen Rider Amazon the Movie is the theatrical version of Amazon's 16th episode, so this is actually just a regular episode of Kamen Rider. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward in its plot. The only flaws it has are that it utilizes some bad Showa tropes, such as the monster telling the plan to the protagonist for no reason, but that's about it. Next. Kamen Rider vs. Ambassador Hell is pretty standard for a Showa movie. Basic plot with Takeshi stopping Ambassador Hell from some evil plot. However, there are some obvious signs of padding, mainly because this film introduces a bunch of fight scenes that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Oh well, at least it doesn't pull that many bad tropes. Plus, it has a consistent story, so that's why it's better than everything that's come before. Finally, we have something new. Pretty Den-O is what I like to call part of the short film franchise. This film is only about 30 minutes long. Now, this film focuses on a completely new character named Anna. She hates her mom, and then afterwards, she doesn't because she found out that the friend she made back in 1989 was actually her own mother. What's with Den-O movie than having weird stories about families? Anyways, this film was pretty meh. There's barely any plot, the characters don't have much to them, and the villains are pretty stupid. Seriously, Shocker's entire point was just to have dumb comedy inserted in. Actually, now that I think about it, everything in this film felt like it was just there for comedy. Shocker, the Taros, the story. So yeah, while it wasn't terrible, there isn't much to like about this film. However, there wasn't too much bad stuff, which is why it's given a 3 out of 10, and it's mostly just harmless fun. Harmless, bad fun. Well, you know how I mentioned that Pretty Den-O was part of the short film franchise? Run All Over the World is the second film I consider to be part of that franchise. Yeah, this film is short. It's 14 minutes long. So, as you can see, there's really not much they can do with the plot or characters. The Crisis Empire sends Kotaro back in time to his time against Gorgon, and then somehow, the future forms of Kotaro all team up to fight together, and then they win. It is pretty cool to see all 4 forms of Kotaro fight together, but my main issue, or rather nitpick, is that the time travel stuff isn't really that clear. Did the Crisis Empire send Kotaro back in time, or revert him to an earlier state? But he still has his current memories, so... Okay, now I'm really getting nitpicky. And boy, if you thought Run All Over the World was short... Kamen Rider World is an 8-minute film featuring Zeto and Jay teaming up against Shadow Moon and his forces. How can this be a movie, you may ask? Well, this movie is included in the Kamen Rider the Movie Blu-ray box, so I think that definitely concludes that this is indeed a movie. Anyways, even though this film is literally just an 8-minute fight scene, it does have a more sensible plot than Run All Over the World. But since this is just nothing but a fight scene, I can't really rank it any higher than this. Funny how a literal 8-minute fight scene ranks higher than 32 movies. That's gotta say something about my taste. Okay, now we're back to the proper films.
君が抱きしめているのはあの日の約束
Yeah, Kamen Rider Eternal didn't really succeed in what it was trying to do. This film was supposed to give backstory on Katsumi and make him look like a fallen hero from grace, but if you analyze the story, that doesn't really happen at all. In the film, Katsumi helps a group of psychics called Quarks by trying to help them escape the island they're held captive on, but after they're all murdered, Katsumi goes insane and becomes a villain hellbent on causing chaos. So it sounds like he was always a good guy, right? Well, even from the very beginning of the film, Katsumi was always hellbent on causing chaos and death in order to take revenge against the museum. He had already planned to construct the X-Picker, which would turn humans into zombies called Necro-Overs. Hell, the reason he was on said island was because he was on a mission as a mercenary, a job that was most likely taken to fund the construction of the X-Picker. In this movie's attempt to humanize Katsumi, we constantly see contradicting info from him. He has this moral code that sees him taking down people only if they willingly enter into battle, and to save those that want to be saved. However, he's shown to have a total disregard for any life that isn't a Necro-Over, shown by how he's killed soldiers that might have not even been willing to fight, but rather drafted into service, and the fact he's already started construction of the X-Picker. If anything, this movie was more about him being insane, back to human for a split second, than back to insane again. Onto the topic of the other characters. We get some backstory for each of the Never crew, but that's about it. Mina's just there to be the narrator of this film, and also be the one who caused Katsumi's descent into villainy. The villain of this film, Dr. Prospect, is pretty generic, even for double standards. We also do get some focus on Junkazu, but all that's revealed about him in this film is why he became a Necro-Over, and that he's also a Quark. With the story, while it does have some good elements, a lot of the bad mainly comes with this film making a bunch of retcons that make the events of Double Forever look stupid. Now, it's revealed in this film that all Necro-Overs need a cell rejuvenating serum just to stay alive, which means that Katsumi's plan in Double Forever to turn everyone in Futo into Necro-Overs is now even stupider in hindsight, since everyone in Futo would have eventually died since there wouldn't be enough serums to keep everyone alive.
Additionally, despite Katsumi claiming he is slowly losing his memories, we can clearly see that is not true in Double Forever, since he references a melody that his mother used to play while he was a teenager. Even the self-contained story this film has does have its faults. The eternal memory glitches out and breaks when Kazu uses it, but when Katsumi uses it, it suddenly repairs itself, which makes no sense. The Mina could track Katsumi's memories despite Katsumi slowly losing his memories plot point is baffling. The whole "we have to stop Dr. Prospect from using a device that could kill all the weak quarks" felt pointless given that Dr. Prospect could just kill them all even without that device, and Mina surviving after her supposed death made no sense. Though, this film still had some enjoyable moments. The fight scenes were entertaining, and I liked the expansion on June. However, the bland story, the retcons that make Katsumi in Double Forever look even stupider, and failing to make Katsumi more humane causes this movie to suffer greatly. Well, it's finally time to talk about a Heisei Phase 1 movie that isn't NO. Godspeed Love just felt like a snooze fest. There really wasn't anything interesting that stood out to me. The only character I enjoyed was Tendo, mainly because of how much charm he usually has, but even that felt toned down in this film, making his character less enjoyable in my opinion. The other characters felt pointless, or changed to the point of being unrecognizable from their good TV counterparts. Kagami is no longer the everyman that we loved in this show, but rather fiancé Hiyori, and that's it. Such a disappointment. Speaking of Hiyori, besides being Kagami's fiancé, she also has an illness for some reason, and then she dies. Yeah, that's all she gets in this film. Now, before I go on to the other characters, I want to explain the basic plot of this film. In an alternate universe, an even bigger meteor hit the Earth, causing all the water on Earth to dry up and bringing millions of worms that quickly took over Earth. Zeks quickly formed to deal with the threat, but Neo-Zeks soon formed afterwards and fought against them. Now, every member in Neo-Zeks felt pointless and unexplored. They wanted to take over the world because freedom, and that's all we know. Hell, why did they even split from Zeks in the first place? And the main villain, Issei, has got to be one of the worst movie villains in Kamen Rider. He appears at the literal end of this film out of nowhere, and he wants the worms to rule over Earth because the strong should survive. Yeah, he's bad. Now the story, and man, not only is it slow, it feels like the first 2/3 of this film don't even matter in the slightest. You could probably skip the entire section and still not miss anything of importance. The relationship between Hiyori and Kagami, the war between Zekt and Neo-Zekt, all there just for drama without substance. Hell, the whole living in a world without water felt underutilized, and it's not until the final third where we finally have some semblance of plot, mainly to make sure the Ladder of Heaven project doesn't go awire, since it's the only shot of Earth gaining back its water. Until it turns out that this was actually all part of Zek's plans to basically genocide humanity because it's a mercy killing. Yeah, no, that plot twist was completely stupid. Overall, this film was just a disappointing mess. All the new characters and villains lacked any sense of charm, character, or motivation. All the returning characters either got watered down to the point of barely being the same as their TV counterparts, or not mattering in the slightest, and the plot was slow and boring, with pretty much the last 15 minutes actually being dedicated to the main plot, while the rest of the film was dedicated to either Neo-Zekt or Kagami and Hiyori's love problems, with neither of them mattering in the grand scheme of things. However, Tendo does bring up the enjoyability quite a bit, and this film does at least have a cohesive story. Plus, the ending does explain a lot about the TV show's lore, which is neat, though that explanation isn't worth sitting through this movie. Well, so much for not having a Heisei movie that isn't NO. Yes, it's Deno's first movie, I'm Born. The build-up to this film was quite interesting, mainly because the show spent 3 episodes building up to this film. However, the actual payoff was quite disappointing. Despite being one of the first Heisei movies to not be set in an alternate universe, this film really doesn't utilize the TV cast in the best way possible. Ryotaro just felt like your typical weak hero in the film, and he doesn't really grow or change in any meaningful way, besides learning what his parents looked like. Yeah, that's his entire arc in this film. Kotaro was just Ryotaro, but younger. And just for clarification, I don't mean Kotaro Nogami, who's Ryotaro's grandson. Kotaro in this context refers to the nickname given to Ryotaro's younger self. Kotaro's role in this film felt completely unnecessary, since despite him being a gateway for learning more about Ryotaro's past, everything that Kotaro reveals is something that Ryotaro shared in the first few minutes of this film. Yuto and the Taros, except Momotaro's, felt completely wasted, since they barely did anything in this film. Hell, despite Sig being the Taros with the second most focus, he barely got any chance to shine or develop. Now we get to Gao. He's just a brute and he wants to erase time, starting with Ryotaro's birth because he's bored of time, I guess. Yeah, he's terrible. Also, like I mentioned when I talked about Final Countdown, shouldn't his plan to erase Ryotaro from time by erasing the time when he was born just not work? Since, well, Ryotaro is a singularity point after all. Hell, Kai erased time in the finale, but even that didn't erase Ryotaro from time. Finally, the story. It had issues in the beginning, but once we got to the Edo period, that's where this film just goes bonkers with its story and starts pulling stuff out of their ass. Most of the Taros are captured by Gao and his forces, and how are they freed from their cage? With Owner breaking it by hitting it with his miniature flag. We could have done that from the very beginning, dude. For some dumb reason, Ryotaro has amnesia, and for that reason, none of the Taros can possess him, except Sig because plot convenience. Then Ryotaro just so happens to regain his memories at the perfect time so we can fight again because even more plot convenience? How time is restored doesn't make any sense, given that time is restored only after Gao is defeated and not the Gao liner, which is the reason why time was erased, and also that it just proves my point that Gao's plan wouldn't have worked since Hana would be there to remember Ryotaro and thus bring him back when time was erased. And the final fight scene was just disappointing, with it just being a compilation of just a bunch of fight scenes and then Momotaro's finishing off Gao. However, the build up to this film was great, and the character moments between Momotaro and Ryotaro was heartwarming, but this film is still quite bad. While the first half was decent, the second half is where this film really gets sloppy. Nothing really interesting happens with the characters, Gao was a pretty bad villain, and the story just had a lot of elements that needed clarification. Plus, this movie does mark for me when Den-O starts degrading in quality, so that's not helping this movie's case much. Well, we've gone through 7 of Den-O's films, which means this next film is my favorite Den-O film. Yeah, I consider Episode Red the best of Den-O's films, but even then, it's not the greatest. It's really only saved by the premise of this film, that being an expansion of Yuto and Airi's relationship. However, there really isn't that much when it comes to expanding the relationship. We basically get 2 scenes that last a total of 18 minutes focusing on the relationship, and what basically happens in those scenes is Airi telling Yuto that, I can't love you because you and Sakurai are different people. Then at the end of the film, Airi tells Yuto that, I think I can love you now because you are similar to Sakurai and also because Sakurai is dead. Seriously? That's it? What a waste. Now, why did these 2 get so little screen time and development? Because the Dunliner crew had to be pushed into this movie as well. Everything they do in this film was a complete waste of time with no merit whatsoever. All they did was just comedic stuff, which severely hindered the enjoyability of this film. That's not even mentioning the villain of this film, which is once again another random Imagin. In addition to the pointless comedy, there are still some story issues this film has, such as Airi somehow remembering Sakurai despite all memories of him being gone, the Imagin hijacking the Dunliner for no reason, and the Imagin now going into the past to live out their lives as the contractor instead of causing chaos in the past. And speaking of the story, there really wasn't even one in the first place, it just felt bare bones as hell. This movie had so much potential to be much, much more interesting than it was. How about we solely focus on Yuto and Airi's relationship and get rid of the Dunliner crew? How about the Imagin is an Imagin based off Yuto's desire to be with Airi, or his hatred for Sakurai because he constantly feels like he needs to live up to him? How about we get more development for both of these characters? Still, for as small as it was, I did like the scenes we got with Airi and Yuto, and the story didn't have as many logical gaps as I'm Born. Oh well, I guess we can close the book on Den-O movies now. Well, time to jump back a couple of decades.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
8 Riders vs. Galaxy King's faults can be summed up in 2 words: missed opportunities. Galaxy King as a character was extremely interesting to me. He was an alien invader that teamed up with Neo Shocker. However, he really didn't have much other than that. Why did he want the Sigma energy, and how did he come to know about it? Why did he team up with Neo Shocker in the first place? Even his demise was anticlimactic, since instead of being brought down by the Kamen Riders, he just failed to escape from an exploding base in time. Honestly, I would have liked it had they had Galaxy King or Neo Shocker backstab the other to at least add something interesting to their relationship in this film. Character-wise, none of the protagonists don't really change or get much, but it's a Showa film, that's to be expected. At least the plot was interesting in the first half. The villains are absolute dog because the scientists uploaded the data of the Sigma energy into its brain, which is just one of the greatest Showa plots I've ever heard. Too bad the pacing of this film just makes it suffer so much. The second half of this film is nothing but one giant fight scene, and you know me, having an extended fight scene with nothing but the sole purpose of having a fight scene does not rank highly in my eyes. Hell, the last 5 minutes of this film are dedicated to watching the same base blow up. This film had an intriguing start, but when it just devolved into nothing but mindless fight scenes, that's when this film really lost me. The returning Riders just felt like an afterthought in my opinion, given how they just showed up out of nowhere for the final fight scene. What's with some Kamen Rider films having really long titles?
Kiva's film, The King of the Castle in the Demon World, is kinda generic honestly. I did like what they did with Wataru and Toei's interactions in this movie, with Wataru coming to accept his father and learn life lessons from him, but honestly, that's really all I liked about this film. Everyone else just felt pointless or forgettable. Hell, the film could have been filled with nothing but Wataru and Toei's interactions, but I'll take what I can get. The villains of this film are pretty wasted in my opinion. Kamen Rider Rei, or Takato, felt really out of place. He's built up as his rival to Nago, but we never really get an explanation for his hatred for Nago. His entire motivation just boils down to gaining power, and that's it. Honestly, they really didn't even need to include him in this film, because we already had another villain in this film. The main villain, Kamen Rider Arc, is a spirit that possesses a prisoner named Takeshi, and he wants revenge against Kiva for stealing him. So yeah, neither villain is exactly good villain material. It's a shame too, since they could have cut Rei from this film to focus more on Arc and his backstory. Though preferably, I wish it was Rei that got more focus over Arc, since he actually seemed to have something interesting to his character. Now, the story does have its problems and issues, such as Wataru suddenly being freed from his brainwashing because of Power of Family, and Takato being baptized by Arc despite the fact that Arc wouldn't even be awake at the time, but my main issue is that this film just feels heavily padded. The film begins with some fluff about Wataru having to attend school while Nago meets with Takato. Then later on, after finding out that Arc has awakened, Wataru goes back to the past to defeat Arc before he can become a menace, eventually teaming with Otoya to take out Arc. However, when that fails, Otoya and Yuri appear in the present day to help defeat Arc for good. So yeah, I basically summed up the entire film in about 3 sentences. And that's not even delving into all the shenanigans that happened in the past, the whole subplot about a musician named Toa and her daughter, and the final act where Yuri and Megami have been kidnapped, Walker goes berserk, and Nago and Takato settle their duel. Though, for as much fluff there is in this film that doesn't amount to much, I still prefer a padded film over a film that just constantly makes up stuff for its story. Plus, the moments and interactions between Wataru and Otoya, for as small as it was, were pretty good. Still, there were a lot of things in this film that could have been better utilized. Well, we might as well end this part with a very important movie. Go-Go Kamen Rider is the first film of the entire franchise, and it's just the theatrical version of episode 13. So yeah. However, the reason it ranks so far, despite being a regular show episode, is that we do see some growth with Takeshi, as he trains himself after losing against the monster of the week. Even though this film doesn't have as many character moments, interesting villains, or engaging plots as some of the movies before it, this film doesn't really have that many faults aside from being forgettable. Plus, even if there basically wasn't any story, this film was still quite entertaining. So yeah, this film ranks above everything else so far for those reasons. Well, I ended the last part with the first ever Rider film, so let's continue on this train of historical importance. Project G4 is the first ever Heisei film for Rider, if you don't count the trilogy of Shin, Zeto, and J, and well, it isn't that good. Well, it's not terrible either, you'll see what I mean later. Also, I'll be giving off a short summary of the film so you guys aren't lost from the get-go. Alright, after an attack on a facility that hones psychics, a pair of survivors, Sayaka and Rei, are found by Shuichi as Risa from the JSDF creates Kamen Rider G4. Risa and the user of G4, Shiro, tries to capture the two psychics in order to make the G4 system even stronger. Eventually, they discover that Mana has even more powerful psychic abilities, leading to them capturing her, which ultimately culminates in a climactic fight resulting in Shiro and Risa's deaths. Now, this may shock some people, but I actually consider Risa to be the best part about this film. Yes, she's a complete bitch who's the typical mad scientist that's completely fine with sacrificing others because everything is for the safety of my country? That's a weird motivation, but honestly, I think her bitchiness is what made her so enjoyable. The actress of Risa, Maju Ozawa, did an incredible job making Risa such a hateable character. However, I will note that I thought Risa could have been more unique, as there really isn't much special about her since her entire character was pretty cliched. Well, if the side villain was so good, what about the main one? No, he sucks. Sure, Shiro had an interesting philosophy where he believed that only those who throw away their desire to live can truly become strong, but that's really all there is to him. His philosophy is literally the only defining trait about his character. However, his philosophy did bring up some good contrast with Ikawa, who was probably the second best thing in this film behind Risa. Sure, even he did little aside from being a foil to Shiro's ideals, but he was the only one who actually felt like his character from the TV series. Everyone else, mainly Shoichi, Mana, and Ryo, really just felt like watered-down versions of their TV counterparts. Plus, Hikawa and Shiro's clash resulted in probably one of the best fights in the franchise. But now, it's time to talk about the bad. First up, Sayaka and Rei. Well, yes, they developed as characters, with Sayaka wanting to be happy and Rei wanting to not rely on his powers all the time, but in the grand scheme of things, they were completely pointless to the narrative, which just makes the scenes we spend with them feel like a complete waste of time. And speaking of complete waste of time, the plot. Yeah, this film is slow and padded to all hell. The first 40 minutes of the film do not have any plot significance other than introducing G4. They added a lot of subplots and artistic choices that really just drag things out. The initial attack on the psychic facility seems like it would play a role, but other than cause Shiro's philosophy to emerge and explain how Rei and Saika would come to meet Shoichi, who are both useless in the film, it really never even comes up again. There's a new viral trend about an ESP test that turns out is being used by the unknowns to kill potential Akitos, which never really gets brought up again, and a bunch of artsy shots involving a piano and some spinning picture thing. Yeah, I know it invokes symbolism or something, but honestly, all it's doing is wasting time since they like to drag those scenes on for a long time. Overall, this film wasn't bad, but it's pretty slow. Hikawa was the only notable protagonist, the side characters were pretty pointless, and the plot didn't really have much substance. Though like I said, Risa was an enjoyable character to hate, and Shiro had an interesting philosophy, but both of these characters were ultimately bland. Well, if you like Build, you probably won't like to hear this next part. Yeah, Be the One was a huge letdown. There are two big issues I have with this movie, but first, summary time. 3 members from the Blood Clan, Kengo, Mitsuomi, and Ryoka, have come to Earth and brainwashed everyone to hate Sento. They then brainwash Ryuga and use his powers and the Pandora's box to try and destroy the Earth, but Sento manages to free Ryuga and together, they manage to stop Kengo and the others' plan. Now, the good stuff really does come from how this movie highlights the bond between Sento and Ryuga, and how it tries to develop Sento, with him wanting to continue fighting for everyone, even if they don't acknowledge or respect him for it. Plus, the plot does move at a reasonable pace, and doesn't ever really feel like it drags on. Okay, now the bad. The villains were honestly pretty weak. They're from the same planet as Evolto, and they want to destroy Earth because they're omnicidal maniacs. Boring. But now, it's time to discuss the 2 big problems this movie has. Its development for Sento, and the numerous retcons this movie makes. I know I praised how this movie tried to develop Sento, but my issue is that it's repetitive. This film once again tells the audience how much Sento and Ryuga changed each other for the better and stuff, but come on, this is like the 3rd time the show accentuates this bond. And the whole Sento warning to fight for others not for recognition or thanks was already covered since he told Ryuga all the way back in episode 3 that he fought to save people for the sake of saving them. But the biggest issue I have with his development is that it once again pulls Sento in a depressive spiral because he was actually being used as a pawn. Yeah, it turns out that Kengo was the one who decided to give Takumi the identity of Sento Kiryu and pretty much orchestrated most of the events that occurred in the series, which causes him to be sad. This happened when he learned about his past about being Takumi. This happened when he learns about Shoichi telling him to become Build to become a quote-unquote hero of justice. This happened when Gontoku berated Sento/Takumi for creating the hazard trigger knowing it could only be useful for war. This happened when he found out that the Build Driver was just a tool for Evolto to reach his final form. This happened when Shinobu was revealed to be working with Evolto and that the Build Driver wasn't intended for justice. Stop pulling this shit. Yeah, this is an issue I have with Build, but it's like the only goddamn thing they can think of to challenge Sento as a character is him finding out some aspect of his life was being used as a tool/pawn for others. And the thing about the revelation in this film is that he should already know this stuff. He knows that Evolto gave him a fake identity and role as a hero. He knows that the Build Driver was intended to be used for destruction, yet we've constantly seen him overcome these issues. Why is it that finding out that it was actually Kengo, not Evolto, that sends him into another depressive spiral? Plus, it always resolves the same fucking way. Even if others plan to use him and his devices as tools for war and evil, he'll use them for justice instead. On to the second issue now. This film made a really dumb choice by making Kengo and the others the big masterminds of the entirety of Build instead of it being just Evolto. I know I mentioned that Kengo was the one who created the identity of Sento Kiryu, but you know what else they did? They were the reason why Sento and Ryuga met up in the first place, and they were the ones who planned for Katsumi to turn into a smash so Ryuga's hazard level would be boosted. The issue is that this makes no sense in the context of the overall narrative of Build and takes away from Evolto's aura of menace. Evolto had a legitimate reason for wanting Sento and Ryuga to raise their hazard levels, Sento to continue refining the perfect weapon suitable for his true form plus the fact he was actually Takumi, and Ryuga to regain the rest of his body. But why in the world did Kengo and the others care so much about Sento and Ryuga that they were content with controlling their lives for a couple of years? Plus, the entire reason why Kengo and the others betrayed Evolto in this film was because they realized he wasn't planning on destroying Earth. So why did you guys decide to mess with Sento and Ryuga for around a decade instead of destroying the world as soon as possible? Oh sure, it's because both of them would help with the destruction of the world. But that contradicts with them controlling Ryuga's life. Remember, Ryuga was only important because he had part of Evolto inside of him. He would have served no purpose to Kengo and the others. Now, Sento was important because his role as a hero helped purify the bottles, but Ryuga? He was literally a nobody to Kengo.
There are also a lot of plot holes and logical gaps when you start to think about things. Shinobu somehow knows that the white from the Pandora's box turned people evil, despite the sky wall rising only seconds before that statement was made, and he would have no way of knowing that information. Kengo and the others' arrival on Earth is baffling, given the fact that they somehow possess the other astronauts that arrived on Mars, which means that either they were also in the Pandora's box when Shoichi touched it, which is improbable since in all the footage we've seen, Yvolta was the only one who came to Mars, nor does Vernage mention the existence of the other 3 Blood Clan members, or the astronauts were always from the Blood Clan in the first place, which is also highly unlikely. The hazard trigger plus Pandora's box just causes the Earth's destruction in this scenario, but later on, it instead creates the white panel because... plot bullshit, I guess. Alright. I know I've ranted about this movie for a long time, and you'd think that it should fall lower than this, but honestly, the movie itself is fine. It's only when you start to apply this film to the bigger narrative build is when the problems start to arrive. I still like Sento in this film, and the plot and pacing were fine. Hopefully this is the last time I make a rant this long. Okay, no long rant this time, I promise. Kamen Rider V3 the movie is the theatrical version of V3's second episode. Why it's only the second episode and not both the first and second episode is confusing, but whatever. Anyways, this film had some good moments. I like the scene where Shiro grieved over his family and the following talk between Shiro and Junko. It really helps hit home the emotional grief that Shiro's feeling and lets us know more about him as a character. Unfortunately, the film really doesn't delve any deeper than that, which is a shame, since they definitely had the perfect situation to reveal more about Shiro as a character. At least the plot was decent. Yeah, everyone talks about the ending with the double riders seemingly sacrificing themselves, but everything before that was pretty generic. Hell, the heroes only stop the plane because the monster of the week tells it to them for no reason. Plus, the film not adapting the first episode really does hurt its ranking, since if you look at it as a standalone movie rather than an episode in a series, you really don't fully understand Shiro's grief or his backstory. Oh well, for what this film is, it's honestly quite good. Oh god. Well, after looking at V3's second episode, it's time to look at the final episode. Get it? Final episode? Like as in episode final? God, someone kill me for that joke. It didn't even make sense. Well, I don't really need a plot summary of this film, it's basically just an alternate ending to the Rider fight. So yeah, what did I like about this film? Well, Miho mainly. Yeah, she was a pretty decent character. She wanted revenge against Asakura for killing her sister, and is also a con artist because she needs the money to keep preserving her dead sister's body. Yeah, that's creepy as fuck. Weird how the film never brings up that odd element of hers again after that scene, but that's probably for the better. Unfortunately, while I did like her backstory, I honestly didn't really feel like she had any charm to her, so she wasn't really that memorable in my opinion. However, she is still arguably the best part about this film, so... With the other characters, I didn't really like them. Both Asakura and Kitaoka got killed off unceremoniously, with neither of them leaving that much impact on the story. Ren barely did anything until the very end, where he had a nice scene with Shinji which highlighted their relationship. Shinji himself? Yeah, I didn't really like him. He was the same naive, gullible fool as he always was for the entire film. Now, there's one character, technically two, but I'll talk about him later, that I haven't talked about yet, and you can probably guess why. Yui. Yeah, this film drops a bunch of exposition about her backstory, the purpose of the Rider fight, and more. Unlike the main universe, this universe's Yui died after staying in the Mirror World for too long as a child, but her Mirror World counterpart extended her life until her 20th birthday. While it was nice learning more about Yui, it didn't actually make her character more memorable. She kind of felt like a plot device rather than an actually enjoyable and intriguing character. Speaking of the plot, it's also kind of boring. Like Project G4, this movie does suffer from lots of padding and slow pacing. However, unlike Project G4, there are some additional plot issues that are a bit more substantial. So for one, how did Shiro know about Yui's condition, since he left for America before Yui went to visit the Mirror World? Second, it turns out that the wish isn't actually a wish, but rather only able to grant new life. Which then calls into question why in the world people like Asakura, Masashi, and Jun would even join the Rider fight, since the reasoning for joining the fight wasn't even tied to reviving someone. Plus, for some reason, Shiro needs to revive Yui before she dies for real, even though the wish shouldn't be dependent on whether Yui's dead or alive for her to be revived. Kitaoka is able to quit the Rider fight, with no consequences, and Shinji, for some inexplicable reason, decides to listen to Dark Shinji and fuses with him. Shinji, why are you that stupid? Oh yeah, Dark Shinji, forgot to mention him. Yeah, he's the other character that has a lot of issues. He's the Mirror World version of Shinji that appears out of nowhere, and all he wants is power, and that's about it. Yeah, like Issei, he's a contender for worst Rider movie villain. Getting back on topic, the reason why this film felt so slow was mainly due to the big subplot of this movie. The relationship between Miho and Shinji. Yeah, sure, it led to some nice scenes between the two, but it just felt ultimately pointless, since none of the character grew or developed because of it. Sure, you can say that the relationship does bring out the more honest and good person within Miho, but unfortunately, we never get to see that before she's killed off. Hell, Shinji never even found out that Miho died, so what was the entire point? Just to waste enough time until the final battle? And speaking of the ending, for being the quote-unquote final chapter of the TV series, it ends on a massive cliffhanger. Final chapter my ass. However, the movie itself did have a nice story, with some good emotional moments that stuck with me. Plus, the story it tells is nice, as long as you don't think about it too much and start to find the issues it has. Why do I keep ranting so much? These movies are rated 4 out of 10. I should be giving them more praise. Well, take my word that despite all my ranting, this movie isn't that bad. Damn, am I really going to anger the Build fanbase again? I think I am. Yes, surprisingly, it's not New World Cross, but rather New World Greece. It's kind of a basic plot, with Kazumi stopping a new evil organization. Anyways, the plot of this film was pretty good, and seeing the build cast in general was great. Plus, the emotional moments of the film were quite good, even if some of them felt repetitive, namely pulling off the whole "the three crows are dead again." Even the story didn't really have that many egregious issues. Yes, there were the minor ones, such as other governments knowing of the Kamen Riders despite Sento/Takumi spending the entire series not wanting the governments to have it, or the fact that literally no one tries to remove the hazard trigger from Keiji, but the biggest issue was only at the very end. So, it turns out that Sento basically lied to Kazumi by telling him that the three crows died again, also that Kazumi would undergo enough mental torment that his hazard level would rise enough to use the power-up. And nobody comments on how fucked up this is? Hell, that entire scene is just treated as a joke, with Kazumi comically cursing Sento. Other than that, the story isn't bad, and there aren't that many issues, so what makes it land here? Well, it's mainly the characters and the villains. Kazumi really doesn't develop or change that much. He got depressed because he got rejected by Misora, but then he eventually gets out of that. Though he apparently gets so depressed that he doesn't even care about her, even with the threat of her being kidnapped. Like, what the fuck? But the worst part has got to be the villains. Simon is the leader of the big bad organization, Downfall. He wants to take over the world, and that's it. Yeah, he's bad, but at least he's killed off by the middle of the movie. Too bad his replacement is even worse. Keiji is probably the worst build movie villain. He has no personality, no emotions, and the motivation behind his plan was actually stupid. He actually had a reasonable motivation for basically wanting to send the world into chaos, a hatred for humanity born out of betrayal and torture. But instead, the film reveals he's actually doing this because no one appreciated my talents back in the old world, so I'll prove my talents are superior by setting the world on fire. Yeah, standard stuff. Overall, New World Greece is a good story that has some small hiccups. While it did backslide on some of the characters, at least it wasn't a major backslide. However, its lack of focus on any of the core characters, especially Kazumi, a repetition of the majority of the emotional beats from the TV series, some weird story elements that made the film awkward, and one awful villain really dragged this movie down. It's really only saved by seeing the build cast all together and the final fight scene with Perfect Kingdom. Well, I don't know how much I can say about this film. O's Wonderful is an average movie that has some bad things about it. That's really all my thoughts about it, but I'll try my best to expand on them. This film kind of felt like a regular episode of Rider. Gaara, an ancient alchemist, is somehow revived and he plans on destroying the world and rebuilding it as its ruler. Eiji and Ankh are forced to stop and blah blah blah, they win, everyone sings and dances. Eiji and Ankh were alright in this film, nothing too atrocious happened. Yeah, they had good moments, but that's all they really were, moments. They didn't really develop because of them. Sure, we see Eiji show he cares about everyone, and that Ankh begins to trust Eiji more, but the former is something we already know, and the latter is ruined by how wishy-washy Eiji and Ankh's relationship is for the rest of the series. The side characters are just there to fill their roles as extra characters we're supposed to care about, and also to corroborate the theme of connecting without words. We mainly focus on a kid named Shun, who believes that his mother hates him, but by the end of the movie, he reconnects with his mother. Oh yeah, Date's in this movie. Too bad he doesn't do anything important. Now, the story is fine, there aren't any major plot holes or unexplained things, with the only ones really being connected to Gaara. Speaking of Gaara, he's terrible. Like I said, he's an ancient alchemist who comes back in the present time by taking over the body of Shun's mother. It also turns out he's one of the original alchemists who created the core metals, and that's as far as that subject goes. His motivation for wanting to destroy then rebuild the world is that he wants to achieve what the original O's couldn't do. Something about being the true O's or being worthy for the name, I don't really remember. His motivation is bad enough, but combined with his non-existent characterization and that his power set is completely bullshit, seriously, how does being an alchemist mean you are able to control time and space? He just drags this movie down, though not by much.
So yeah, that's really all I've got to say about this film. The plot's fine, the characters weren't bad, but they really didn't do much or grow, and the villain was bland and boring. Drive Savamok had the potential to develop Go in a meaningful way, but unfortunately it failed to capitalize on that opportunity. This movie doesn't feel like a movie focused on Go, but rather a regular episode of Drive with just a slightly bigger budget. However, the main plot isn't anything fancy or special, it's just a love story between Go and Reiko, which is pretty disappointing. Yeah, that plot is the main reason why this movie is a little average. The only expansion Go gets is getting the courage to confess his true feelings, and Reiko's expansion is just being freed from the shackles of her father. Sure, I liked her development and her relationship with Go, I just wish it wasn't in a movie that was focused on Go. And the villain of the film is Roidmead005, who copied Reiko's father, the corrupt killer Koya. Yeah, that's the only reason why he's evil. So yeah, while the relationship between Go and Reiko did help to keep the movie going and also slightly develop these characters a bit more, the fact that this was the main focus of the film really just disappoints me. 005 is bland, and I wish that the film just had a story focused on Go alone. Man, another short section. Yeah, it's kinda hard for me to talk about some movies I find average. Not really much else I can say other than it's just okay. Well, another film focused on a vehicle-themed secondary. Yeah, Double Returns Axel is also just below average. While this is basically just a movie about Ryu dealing with the Dopant case, it's the other subplot of this film that drags it down. The whole Akiko and Ryu marriage problem plot. Don't get me wrong, Ryu was a badass through and through in this film, but it's Akiko I feel like got the short ends of the stick. I get it. The writer probably wanted to focus on Ryu and Akiko's relationship for the film since it was mainly just in the background in the TV series, but did they really have to focus on it in such a way that made both characters, especially Akiko, extremely stupid? In summary, the problem arises because Akiko believes Ryu doesn't love her because he doesn't call her Akiko, but rather Chief, which is made worse when Akiko believes Ryu has fallen for the client of their case instead because they're spending so much time together. Ugh. Yeah, this might not be a very common opinion, but I don't find Akiko that annoying of a character. Yes, sure, she caused problems in the beginning of Double, but she did grow out of those, as seen in the arc where she learns what it means to be a true detective. But to see her in this film, where she's reverted to a paranoid and selfish mess that doesn't really care about the problems she causes others, makes me really disappointed. She should know that Ryu will do anything for his clients cause, you know, that's a philosophy shared by him, Shotaro, Philip, and her own father. Hell, she even believes in the same philosophy of doing anything to save a client, as shown at the end of the Sweet Dopant arc. Speaking of the client, her name's Aoi. She's a pickpocket that hates cops because one of them shot her father, who was also a criminal, despite him already surrendering. Other than that, she's really just there to exist as the reason why Akiko and Ryu are bickering. Sure, her development does tie into the film's themes of anyone can change, since she eventually trusts in the police and swears off a life of crime, but neither Akiko and Ryu were really connected to that theme in the first place, so the whole subplot seems out of place. Also, the cop that killed her father turns out was the villain of this film, Hiroshi Sagami. He's a decent villain. He hates all criminals since one of the criminals he arrested got revenge by killing his wife. This tragedy, alongside the corruption brought by the Gaia memories, drives him to kill all criminals, believing they can only be saved through death. One problem though. This is the exact same thing as the Triceratops Dopant. You know, a Dopant who was also a police officer who wanted to get revenge on criminals for killing a person close to them, eventually succumbing to the Gaia memories corruption and was forced to be stopped. Overall, while this film's quality can be described as generically decent, it was brought down by the whole Akiko and Ryu bickering that lasted the entire film. Plus, Akiko basically backsliding in her development for this film just so they could develop her back into the character she was kinda stupid. Otherwise though, everything else was decent. The story was fine, if not a little bland. Ryu was a complete badass, though I find he really didn't get much in terms of expansion. Hiroshi was an okay villain, only really brought down by the fact we've already seen a villain exactly like him in Double, and Aoi actually felt like a character instead of some random muck whose only purpose is to push the film along. Too bad she's the reason why the worst part of this film exists. You know, it's surprising how forgettable this film is. Yeah, even though this film is pretty high up, I'll be honest and say that I completely forgot the true ending even existed. It's not like it was bad or anything, but it was extremely bland, and you can see where my problems lie with this film. The main cast are all fine in this film, but honestly, there really isn't much to them. Emu's the guy that gives hope to everyone, Hiro's the cold guy, Taiga's the jerk, Kiria's relaxed, Kuroto's deranged, Poppy's there for sport, etc, etc, etc. Honestly, it's like the film tried to make these characters as bare bones as possible while still resembling their TV counterparts. Well, at least no one backslided on their development.
Even the villains aren't spared from being bare bones as all hell. Kamen Rider Fuma, or Kaganari, is a man who just cares about making his daughter happy, even if it means making her live a lie in a VR world. Then he realizes what he's doing is wrong, and he decides to reform himself. That's it. Johnny Maxima is even worse, once again just being a CEO with a god complex, but without any depth or complexities to him. Now, the overall story and flow is fine. Sure, there is a bit of a weird disconnect when looking at the first half of the film compared to the second half, but it doesn't drag the film down that much. No, my problems lie with how much unexplained stuff there is, which specifically lies with the villains and the main side character, Madoka. Oh, before I go on to the unexplained issues, Madoka herself is another issue. She's a terminally ill girl who is the center of the VR world that Kakanari and Johnny's created. She seemingly hates reality, which is why she decides to stay in the VR world even while it's being destroyed. However, the true reason why she wants to stay in the VR world is because she knew that would make her father happy, which is Kaganari. Yeah, bull fucking shit. Are you telling me that this girl who hasn't seen her father since she was probably a baby knew that the one who put her into the VR world was her father and that he did all of this for her? Sure, they brushed this off by stating that Madoka only stayed in the VR world because she knew it would make someone happy, but not exactly sure who, but that sounds even worse. I'm not sure if I would be happy being kidnapped because it would make someone else happy. Also, her characterization is non-existent and she only exists to push the plot of the movie forward. Okay, back to the unexplained stuff. So, we know that Kaganari is Madoka's father, but why you left her in the first place is never explained. Why you went to work with Johnny is also never explained. Why did the powers of 3 random Gasha trophies that came from the game world Madoka was trapped in grant the power of Gamduas to Johnny? Say it with me now, never explained. There are more story issues I've got, but they're pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, so I won't bother talking about them. Still, you can probably see where I come from with this film. All the protagonists are bland and bare bones, the villains are one note with a lot of unexplained details that drag them down, and Madoka was a side character that just confused me. Though like I said, the overall story and pace is fine, which is why this film is only below average. Still though, this is honestly probably one of the most forgettable Kamen Rider films. It's another dry film. Well, you can probably guess this one. Yeah, Drive Saga Heart also isn't that great. Don't get me wrong, it's decent, but well, there could have been a lot more. I like the focus on Heart, but did he really have to share the screen time with Medic and Brain? I mean, yeah, I enjoyed seeing them all interact, but they didn't really do much other than provide comedy. Hell, I find it odd that both Brain and Medic now love humanity in this film. Sure, the final arc saw the 3 team up with Shinosuke and the others, but that was really just to fight a common enemy. They didn't do it because they suddenly love humans. Back to Heart, while he did develop, it's not a development that I'm a fan of. He basically learns the importance of human heart. Except, he already knew the importance of heart. Sure, maybe not human heart, but like, come on, the dude's name is fucking Heart. This is the guy whose gimmick was deeply caring for each Roidmude and genuinely felt sent by each of their deaths. It would have been better for the film to have him come to expand his caring nature to humans as well, instead of telling him, well, you love humans, but you have to understand why they're strong. The main villain is also someone I have issues with. Roidmu 5886 is the combination of the fragmented data of all 108 Roidmudes, and he wants a new wife. Yeah, that's it. He's seriously bland. The only thing I remembered about this dude was that 5886 is all the numbers from 1 to 108 added together. It said that that's the most memorable part about him. At least the story's somewhat decent. I mean, yeah, they did have this weird buddy cop thing with Heart and Oda, but it wasn't terrible, just unnecessary. The rest of the story is pretty standard, but at least the interactions between the Roidmu trio make it fun to watch. So yeah, an average film that, ironically, doesn't feel like any heart was put into it. Sure, there were some impactful moments and the pacing is fine, but it feels like the film tried to make Heart develop, even if it meant making him go through an arc that doesn't make much sense for the dude, instead of telling a compelling story with him. Well, another short film, and this time it's Gaim's first film in this list. Gaim Gaiden Baron is the worst Gaim film, but that doesn't mean it's terrible. While we did get an expansion of Kaito's characters, I found it incredibly odd that the show didn't simply state this in the actual TV show. We learned that his lust for strength stems from Yggdrasil basically destroying his father's factory, which eventually led to both of his parents committing suicide and making him despise his weakness to do anything to help them. Sure, it's nice that we learn what motivated his desire for strength, but did it really have to be in a film released after the show had already concluded? However, the biggest issue about this film is that it's not really focused on Kaito. Sure, he may have gotten some reveals about his past and is the titular character, but this film focuses on a complete random character and his problems instead. Shapul is a rich kid who just so happens to look exactly like Kaito. After some shenanigans, it turns out that Shapul ran away from home because he believes his father will kill him, but Kaito teaches Shapul to face his problems head on. The villain of the film is also more connected with Shapul's issues instead of Kaito's. Alfred is Shapul's butler who wants power, and yeah, also bland and lame.
I mean, I like the details we learned about Kaito in this film, and the overall plot moves along fine, and had some great comedy moments, but it's really just dragged down by how much it focuses on a completely random character instead of Kaito. Also, the villain being a complete nobody, but whatever. It's basically a given that most Kamen Rider movie villains suck. Another Gaim film. Is Gaim going to be the Den-O of this part? Yeah, for as surprisingly goofy the film concept is, Great Soccer Battle isn't that bad. Sure, the concept of Gaim but soccer was overall pointless in the grand scheme of things, but at least it had some entertaining moments. Kota doesn't do much except be the audience surrogate to learn more about this new soccer world. Sure, he does prove that he fights for everyone, but he's already shown that in episodes prior, so what's the point in repeating it again? All the other characters are just lackluster, so there's really not much else I can say about them, other than that they at least move the plot along at a decent pace. Well, all the other characters with the exception of the movie's main side character, Lapis. He's an overlord that created this soccer world, and he hates humans, believing they're the same as overlords in that they only want power to fight against each other. But after seeing Kota use his powers to save others, he decides that he was wrong and helps Kota and the others defeat the villain of this film. Yeah, he's the only reason why Kota spouted that "not all humans that want power are bad" speech. Sure, he developed over the course of the film, and I liked it. But it just felt pointless since, once again, we already know that Kota wants power to protect his friends. You don't have to keep beating it into our head. Finally, we get to the villain of this film, Kogain. He was born from an artificial golden fruit that the overlords created, and drives everyone to start killing each other because it would help fertilize the artificial golden fruit inside of him? Okay. All he cares about is being the ultimate being of the universe, so standard Rider movie villain motivation. There are also some small issues I have with his backstory and power set, but they're pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, so let's just say it's me overanalyzing Kamen Rider too deeply again. So yeah, while this was a nice film, my main issue is that it's a film that doesn't really enhance the experience of Gaim at all. Oh, we get to see Kota stand up against evil and say he fights for his friends for like the 4th time. Yeah, real thrilling. This film doesn't develop the story of the characters of the TV show in any meaningful way. At least there were some standout moments, such as that final transformation scene. However, what drags it down to a 4 out of 10 is the characters of Lapis and Kogain. If they were a bit better, this would probably be one of the most average films in Kamen Rider. Well, it's been a while since we've had a movie war film in this list, so let's talk about one now, shall we? Movie Warcore is a pretty split bag in my opinion. I love Message for Skull, I hate Nobunaga's Desire, and I find the movie Warcore section below average. So let's start off with Message for Skull. Honestly, the only real issue I have about this part is the context behind it, mainly with the Yummy using the memory guy memory to have Akiko watch the story of Sokichi's first transformation into Skull. Plus, having Akiko learn that Kamen Riders endure tragedy support others is a bit redundant, but other than that, it's pretty great. The expansion of Sokichi was pretty great. It's nice finally being able to see more of the badass himself, and we did get a closer look at his character. He's essentially a Showa Rider, becoming a monster to fight the Dopons, forced to work alone after killing his best friend, and forced to never see his daughter again out of kindness. Though I will note that him refusing the skull memory a bit weird, but honestly, it's not that big of an issue. Plus, I love the overall story. Sure, it was just a Dopon case, but it had a good mystery vibe, and I really did like the villain, Matsui. He had a noble cause, taking the Dopon memory because he wanted to help Melissa, but due to the corruption of the Gaia memory, he's eventually forced to be put down by Sokichi. It's pretty tragic. But now we get to the other section, Nobunaga's Desire. Let me just say this simply, this part is the complete mess. It's probably because the main writer of this part was Inoue and not Kobayashi, which leads to a lot of awkward characterization, weird story beats, and contradiction with the TV series. The biggest example of this is the mention of the Greed Gill, the one behind creating the dinosaur yummies, except we never see him in the series proper. Like I hinted before, I find Eiichi's characterization a bit odd. Sure, it's only a minor thing, but I find that he's basically turned into a hero that helps everyone no matter what. I mean, yeah, he helps people, but not by literally doing everything for them, but rather teaching them to stand up on their own. He gives away money to people fully knowing that they're just leeching off of him, but he doesn't mind. Didn't one two-parter of O's deal with this exact issue of giving people money, even if it's for a good cause? Also, wouldn't he have been a bit more cautious of giving random people money, given that his past involves being held for ransom, which was then twisted to have people support his father? Anyway, that's just a bit of a tangent. And to reiterate, I'm not saying Eiichi's character was bad in this film, just different from his usual self, which felt odd. Now let's talk about the titular character, Nobunaga. He was revived in the modern world by Kogami because they both like Desire. Yeah, that's the only reason why he got revived. Anyways, he then spends most of his time wandering around, with the only thing he can remember being his own name. He meets with Eiji, they become friends, and then he becomes the president of the company because he read a lot of books. Oh, is that too fast for you? Well, this part doesn't care about pacing, so why should I? Anyways, his main plan is to conquer the world, starting with Japan by obtaining the Hatuhana, Nita, and Narashiba. However, his body begins to break down and he starts to lose his memories again, but Eiji tells him that life is fun already, so he shouldn't focus too much on desire. Then he dies. Yeah, the whole plot revolving around Nobunaga really makes this part suffer. Nobunaga is a bland character, only wanting to conquer Japan because that's what the real Nobunaga was like, or something. Sure, he did learn that too much desire is bad, but the path for that development was paved with boring scenes. I also find it odd that they tell Nobunaga that too much desire is bad, but never tell Eiji that not having any desire is also bad. And lastly, the core portion of this film is honestly forgettable. Core is born out of nowhere thanks to the Memory Gaia memory and Black Horn medals, don't even ask where those came from. Eiji, Shotaro, and Velop team up, they defeat Core, the end. So yeah, overall, a very mixed bag. Message for Skull was great for the expansion of Tsukichi and telling a great story in general. Nobunaga's desire was bad because of how messy and boring the plot was, and the core portion just felt way too rushed. This won't be the only time a movie war has one really good section and one really bad one. I guess this movie was missing its ace. Alright, I'll stop with the bad puns. Yeah, Missing Ace is quite the generic film. How many times have I said that already? Since this is a Heisei Inui film, this is an alternate universe film where Kanzaki ends up stealing Hajime. I liked Kanzaki and Mutsuki in this film since we spent a good amount of time with them adjusting to life not being a writer and how their experiences of being a writer affected them. For Kanzaki, he's become a garbage man but yearned for those days of being a writer since he was able to help and protect others and regrets having to steal Hajime. Mutsuki wants to forget about his time as being a writer since he spent most of the time under the Spider Undead's control, but it's clear that no matter how much he tries to shut it out, he still can't get the thought of being a writer again out of his head. It's then unfortunate that after both of these characters get their powers back, they fall into the standard goody two-shoes hero that does their best. Now, you may be asking about Tachibana and Hajime, and well, they're kinda disappointing. Tachibana has become the new head of board, and that's it. Hajime only shows up at the last act of the film, and that's also it. I wish that either of these characters did more, since they honestly felt wasted. Now, while the other side characters have some focus, mainly showcasing how much they've changed since Hajime's sealing, the only character I really want to focus on is Amane. After Hajime's sealing, she's basically become a brat, believing that everyone important to her has abandoned her to pursue their own things. She then eventually changes out of being a brat after Hajime talks to her. Her development was alright, but it was boring, not helped by her being, for no reason, the only method to open the monolith, which are why the villains are after her. Speaking of villains, they're all boring. Shin and Natsumi are honestly just there to waste screen time. Both barely have any characterization before they're killed off. Junichi is at least slightly better than both of them, only because he actually has some screen time. He's the albino Joker, and his main plan is to gain the monolith's power because he wants power. Well, I said he was only slightly better. Sure, he has a personality of being unhinged, but that barely makes up for how cliched his character is. With the story, it just felt oddly slow and boring. I mean, the pacing's fine and I wasn't that bored. Maybe it's because the film tried to juggle two stories at once, the plot with the new writers and returning writers, and the plot focusing on how Amane and the others have changed over 4 years. Sure, the story was well written and didn't have any gaping plot holes, but I think them trying to juggle both plots at the same time just led to a disorientating narrative. I can't really explain it that well, something about this film just felt bland, lifeless, and charmless. Overall, Missing Ace has a decent story, but something about it I just can't explain that makes it bad. Kanzaki and Mutsuki were interesting at the start, but they quickly fell back into their standard characters. Hajime, Tachibana, and the other side characters basically did nothing, and the subplot with Amane didn't really entice me that much. Plus the villains were terrible, with none of them really having a character. Well, at least there were some good emotional moments, especially the scenes with Kanzaki and Hajime. Well, it's time for Gaim film number 3-ish. Is the Fateful Sengoku movie battle a Gaim film or a Wizard film? Doesn't matter. Funny enough, I think Gaim section is what drags this movie down, but honestly, Wizard's portion isn't that much better. It mainly deals with Haruto and the effect that Koyomi's death had on him. Sure, this sounds like a good idea on paper, but all that really happens is Haruto talking about how much Koyomi meant to him, which has been something that's been covered enough in the TV series, so it feels like it's treading old ground. Well, it could be worse. At least it doesn't blatantly repeat character developments, unlike Gaim's part, where the major portion of the runtime is Koto learning to use his powers to protect others, which is something both he and we should already know at this point. There are also other characters that get focused, but honestly, they really aren't worth mentioning. Wizard's portion pretty much exclusively focuses on Haruto, while Gaim more focuses on Koto learning to use his powers for others. Anyways, with their stories, I've already mentioned that Wizard's portion deals with Haruto dealing with the loss of Koyomi. Meanwhile, Gaim deals with Kota, Kaito, and the others being transported to the alternate world of the Bujin Riders. So yeah, you can tell that Wizard's portion is arguably the more interesting of the two, which is partly the reason why it's better. Though as a trade-off, Wizard's portion has a lot more story issues that I found, while Gaim's section has slow pacing and kind of a slog to get through. Now with the villains, they're both pretty bad. Even though Ogre was just a standard Phantom of the Week, I felt like he was the better villain of the two since he wasn't shrouded in mystery, unlike Bujin Gaim. Bujin Gaim wants to rule over the world and he summons Kaito, Kota, and Mitsuzane to his world and kills the other Bujin riders and combines himself with a big tree that holds all the riders' power and also needs might to complete his domination of the world or something. Okay, why? Overall, this would be an average movie, but it suffered from a weak and boring Gaim portion, mediocre but repetitive Wizard portion, and terrible villains that were generic, bland, and had zero explanation for their power sets. Well, this movie will probably shock you with how high up it is. Yeah, there's pretty much one reason alone why Stronger's movie, or the theatrical version of episode 7, ranks this high. It actually has charm to it. Oh sure, the plot's stupid as hell, with Black Satan taking over a restaurant just to turn people into slaves, but that wasn't as big as an issue. Shigeru really does bring a lot to make this film enjoyable. His swagger and demeanor led to a lot of enjoyable moments, and I really liked his dynamic with Yuriko in this film. And there were some nice moments of tension, with Shigeru supposedly being mind controlled while Yuriko stuck in a trap. But for as enjoyable as this movie was, I can't really rank it any higher, mainly because there was no plot, no sense of grandeur, and it had some generic villains. Speaking of shocking movie placements, yeah, I find Heisei Generations a disappointment. Surprising since this movie probably ranks a bit higher for most people. The plot's fine, the pacing's alright, and the overall enjoyability was fine. However, my main issue with this film can be summed up into 3 categories: terrible handling of the characters, terrible villains, and story issues. Let's start off with the least egregious of the 3, the story issues. Now, you can probably tell I nitpick way too much when I watch writer stuff, and yeah, that's exactly what I did for this film. They're very small issues in the grand scheme of things, but they did ruin my immersion in this film. Things such as why exactly our movie exclusive character Toga was targeted, Takeru getting his powers back, how the villains were able to escape from the game world, the Ghost Riders being able to take down the Bucksters, and more. Next issues, the villains. They're all pretty bland and forgettable. The 3 lackeys, Soji, Kazushige, and Ageha, all have one trait defining them: strong, smug, girl fighter. Be honest, did any of you actually know their names by heart? Our main villain is Dr. I mean Michiko Zaisen. Yeah, Michiko Zaisen. Yeah, other than promotional reasons, there was no reason for Michiko to disguise himself as Dr. Pac-Man. The whole who is Dr. Pac-Man mystery just felt forced as all hell. Anyways, his plan is to become the ultimate being because he wants to save people from an illness because it's for the greater good. To achieve this, he releases a virus to locate a person with a certain bugster virus strand, but will infect anyone else with a deadly virus instead that will eventually kill them. To save people my ass, Duke could have easily just programmed the virus to solely be used for tracking. So yeah, he's pretty bland and underdeveloped. Finally, handling of the characters. Good lord, did the writers screw this up. Any of the characters beside Takeru and Emu did nothing. Ghost side characters were especially egregious since they all just got reduced to being a part of Takeru's fan club. The Legend Riders, while nice to see them again, really felt underutilized, and Togo just felt completely unnecessary. He's the most important character in this film, but we hardly know anything about his character and motivation. All we know is that he loves programming video games, but is bashful towards others. But after the events of the film, he starts warming up to others. With Takeru, they really didn't utilize him at all. He was basically just his standard self. Which is funny because I consider him the best character of the film. Yeah, it's because they didn't try to screw up his character. Unlike Emu, good lord, what did they do with him? To know, I like that they try to challenge him in this film, but it just comes off as extremely childish and petty. To best present why I found this whole thing dumb and stupid, I'll basically sum up the entire development Emu had. After Togo is captured by the villains, Emu laments despite curing everyone of the Pac-Man virus, which was around 100,000 lives, he couldn't save Togo, and believes he's a worse doctor than both Hiro and Taiga because they were able to save Makoto and Awan. He then doubts himself as a doctor, but after Poppy reminds him that he became a doctor to save others, he gets motivated to fight again. Do you see why I find this whole thing stupid? And it sucks, because this is the only thing Emu gets in this film. He comes off as a child that needs to be perfect without flaws. Wah, I couldn't save one person even though I saved 100,000 lives. Wah, I'm a worse doctor than most Hiro and Taiga. Wah. I want to reiterate this again. I do not find this a bad film. I find this an average film with some negative things. The overall plot is fine, the pacing is good, the action's amazing, and I love seeing all the Legend Riders return, but some small story details, bad villains, and terrible character handling just bring it down. I know I make it sound like I hate this movie for what it did to the characters, but honestly, I'm just more disappointed in it. Alright, now it's time for the Build fanbase to hate me even more.
I find New World Cross the best build movie. I know people hate it for basically undoing everything the character sacrificed in the final arc, and while I agree it's bad, it's not that bad as everyone makes it out to be. However, even though I call this the best build movie, it still isn't even ranking a 5 out of 10, so what's bad about it? Well, I'm glad you asked, hypothetical viewer, but let's begin with a plot summary. After the creation of the New World, Evolto's brother, Kilbus, appears, and after some shenanigans, everyone's memory of the old world comes back and Evolto's revived. He teams up with Ryuga to kill Kilbus, they succeed, and then Evolto fucks off to space or something. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about the decent things in this film. Yeah, other than the action and seeing all the characters interact with each other, there's really not much else I found good in this film. First off, Ryuga. Here's the thing about him in this movie, while I did like him, all the film really does is just reinforce how far he's come as a person, fighting for others instead of himself. Wow, how heroic. He doesn't grow, get challenged, or do anything really that's striking in this film. The best he does is, well, I was bad in the past, but now I'm good. Second, Evolto. Ooh, I really am angering the fanbase, aren't I? Yeah, I know that most people hate his portrayal in the movie because he basically acts like a completely different character, but honestly, I don't find that as bad. Sure, his characterization is pretty odd, but he does bring some charm to the film, so he's not that bad. He's a mediocre part of the movie, if that soothes your soul. Let's talk about villains now. No, I'm definitely not trying to distract you from my previous comments, trust me. While Kilbus is honestly a generic villain that wants to destroy the universe because I love destruction, I find he's probably the best build movie villain since he brings a lot of life to his character. Too bad it doesn't make up for how bland he is. Plus the plot is decently paced, with some cool looking shots and probably one of the hypest movie songs. Cross is legit a good banger. But now it's time to talk about the worst aspects of the film, plot retcons and Yui. Even though they're two separate things, the biggest issues of both are linked to each other, so I'll talk about them together for now. Yui was originally kidnapped by Evolto after Ryuga failed to save her because he was too busy fighting. She was tortured and killed, resulting in a wasp bottle, but revived in the New World. She initially hates Ryuga for abandoning her, but she falls for him after realizing he's not the same person he was before. You can see my issue, right? Other than serving as a love interest and reflecting how far Ryuga's developed, she serves no other purpose. Everything about her own character is either briefly touched upon or forgotten after being mentioned. Now, here's where the plot retcon issues come into play. You know how I mentioned that Ryuga failed to save Yui and thus was killed to create a wasp bottle? Well, Ryuga only neglected to save her because he was only fighting for himself at the time, not for others. Now, from that statement, we can confidently place Yui's abduction somewhere in between episodes 10 and 14, because unless Ryuga learned nothing after the events of Heisei Generation's final, he learned to fight for others at the end of that film. Sure, you can technically argue that Ryuga was a dumbass that continued to fight for himself well into the early 30s, but I highly doubt that. Now, because of this, we can conclude that Evolto has known about the wasp bottles and has had one in his possession since at least episode 14. You could also argue that Yui was kept alive until the early 30s, but I highly doubt that Evolto tortured her for months on end. Yeah, unless Evolto is the biggest dumbass to exist, there is no way he would have just had multiple wasp bottles laying around doing nothing for months and not actively trying to utilize them. Other small plot issues include how Kilbus even snuck himself onto the white Pandora panel, how he managed to create another Pandora's box out of thin air, and why in the world Sento would he create the spider transformation device even though he literally states Kamen Rider shouldn't be needed in this world, not even a minute later after showing it to Ryuga. Overall, while this film was average with a fine pacing and cool shots, it's just dragged down by Kilbus being boring, Ryuga doing nothing other than look how far I've come, the plot retcons, and Yui's entire deal. Like Be the One, this film is fine as a standalone film, but it's really only an issue if you start applying what we learned in this film to the overall narrative of Build. Man, 2 long rants. I really gotta stop talking about the negative things and focus on the good more. Well, I know I won't be talking about this film much. Yes, Gaim film number 4, and it's Gaim Gaiden Zangetsu. No, not Zangetsu Gaim Gaiden, that's different. While it wasn't decent exploration about Takatora's past, it was overall just repetitive. The main thing we learn about Takatora in this film is that he doesn't have the guts to execute Project Arc, which is something we already knew, and he wants to go back to the past where everything was much more peaceful. Honestly, I would have liked it had this been an origin story on Takatora, watching him first transform into Zangetsu and learning what shaped his character at the beginning of the series. At least the villain is pretty decent. Toko was Takatora's father's maid, and she seemed to have a nice relationship with Takatora. However, she reveals herself to be Kamen Rider Idun, wanting revenge against the Kurishima family for torturing her, as she was tortured by Takatora's father as a child. She had a decent motivation, and I liked her relationship with Takatora, but her characterization is quite bland. Oh yeah, plot. Well, not much I can say about it. The film's only 30 minutes long, so there really aren't any pacing issues. There aren't any big story issues either, and it's kinda like a fun, mindless story. Okay, fun might be stretching it, more like a regular episode of Gaim. However, there is one reason why this movie is still only a 4 out of 10 and not a 5 out of 10, and that's all the new plot reveals this movie includes.
So you know how I mentioned that Toka wanted revenge against the Kurishima family for torturing her? Well, it turns out she wasn't the only one. Takatora's father had been running experiments on children to turn them into Yggdrasil members, and it turns out that Ryoma is also one of these Yggdrasil children. Does it expand the world of Gaim? Yes. Does it explain anything from the TV series? No. Did this plot point even matter or explain anything in the overall narrative of Gaim? No. So why did this film even bother including these things that don't matter if it just meant taking away more time from developing Takatora? Other than that, this film's fine. Decent expansion on Takatora, decent film, and a decent story. These last 4 movies are all ranked 5 out of 10 now, and the first one is another Gaim film. Go figure. Yeah, Gaim Gaiden Do only ranks above Gaim Gaiden Zangetsu since it doesn't introduce that many things out of left field. Other than that, they're pretty much on par in terms of quality. On the topic of Ryoma, we really don't learn much about him in this film that hasn't already been shown in the TV series. Yes, it was nice to see how his relationship with Takatora was in the beginning, but the film just basically tells the audience that Ryoma's always disliked how Takatora wanted to use power for others and not just himself, and that Takatora was the only one who saw Ryoma's potential, which are both things the TV show has already covered. We also do get some backstory on the new Genesis writers, mainly that Yoka was a spy and Sid was just some random thug, both of them eventually getting hired by Ryoma. Finally, the villain, Kugai. He's pretty bland as a character, but he does have an interesting backstory. He was originally the first one to use the lock seed, but the experiment ended up vaporizing his body, setting his spirit free. His motivation is to become god of the world, and that's it. Yeah, other than how generic his goal is and an unexplained mystery of how he even got his powers, he's overall just generic. Alright, well, that's all I can really say about this film. Basically just a slightly better Gaim Gaiden Zangetsu. Bear with me for a minute. I'm just gonna let the entirety of this film's intro play out. Real talk, I love that intro. Too bad it's not winning any brownie points because of it. Back on topic, I find Hibiki and the Seven Senki the definition of an average Rider movie. Since this isn't a new Heisei film, this takes place in an alternate universe, though unlike the other films, this does not serve as an alternate conclusion for Hibiki. Most of the plot takes place back in the past, and since the present plot doesn't really matter too much, I won't be talking about it. Alright, summary time. In the Sengoku era, a village is forced to sacrifice a girl every year to the Makamo known as Orochi. Asumu's ancestor, who's also called Asumu, decides to put a stop to Orochi and gathers 7 Onis: Kabuki, Ibuki, Todoroki, Tooki, Kirameki, Nishiki, and Habataki. However, it turns out Kabuki is a traitor, with Hibiki eventually revealing himself and taking down Kabuki. With that, Hibiki teams up with the other Oni, and then the story ends abruptly, cutting forward to the present where present Osamu helps the present Hibiki kill off Orochi. With that out of the way, let's talk about the characters first. Unfortunately, pretty much all of them, save for Kabuki, are all pretty one note. Osamu hated Hibiki because he believed he killed his brother Takeshi. Hibiki regrets not being able to save Takeshi. Tooki was a Buddhist, Nishiki was a smug thief, Kirameki is loud, Ibuki is a daimyo, and Habataki is a family man. Todoroki is the only one that pretty much remains the same as his present counterpart, but even he's dumbed down, just being the new guy who looks up to everyone. And Kabuki, you know what, I'll talk about him later. Let's talk about the plot for now. There are some small issues I have with the story, but overall it's fine. However, there is one major problem that leads me to denoting it as an average movie instead of a good movie. That is the fact that this movie tries to juggle 2 plots at the same time. I've already mentioned the plot about gathering Oni in a group to defeat Orochi, but there was also a subplot about the racism towards Oni by humans. Sure, I like the subplot and the scenes that involve dealing with that topic, but unfortunately, I just found it ultimately detracted from the more interesting plot of gathering Oni to fight Orochi. Plus, it basically forced Kabuki to be a twist villain to neatly resolve that subplot, despite the fact that this movie already had a main villain in the form of Orochi. Honestly, this film would have been better had they either stuck with just the Oni versus Orochi plot, or Humans Hate Oni plot, so the film wouldn't get muddied by trying to juggle the two. Back to the topic of Kabuki, he's a very special character. You know why? Because he's actually a good movie writer villain. He first comes off as a crass man who's driven by profit, but he does have a heart of gold. But when the betrayal is revealed, he reveals his plan to become a Makamo to destroy humanity. Why? Well, it's because he got fed up with humans constantly treating him like shit, always being ignored and despised despite all the help he's given them. Even after his betrayal, he still has a soft spot for Asumu, showing there's more than just a man filled with hatred towards humans. Though unfortunately, after he is revealed as a villain, he doesn't get as nearly as much focus as I would have liked, and like I said before, I find his status as a villain unnecessary since Orochi was already a main villain. To repeat myself, this film is the definition of an average movie. Most of the characters are one note, but they do at least have some charm to them. Kabuki is a good movie villain, but I just found him an unnecessary addition. The overall plot's fine, but it's certainly held back by juggling two plots at once. Man, it only took 60 movies, but we finally got an average movie. I know I said Gaimgaiden Duke was a 5 out of 10, but that film's a low 5 out of 10, if that makes any sense. Man, I really can't stop talking about Gaim this part, can I? Well, my favorite Gaim film is indeed Gaimgaiden Knuckle, unless you want to count movie War Full Throttle. Similar to Gaimgaiden Zangetsu, Duke, and Baron, this movie serves to expand Zack and learn about his past, but unlike the other films, this one actually develops him properly. We do learn how Team Baron formed, but the more interesting part is the growth that Zack undergoes, namely learning to face his weakness head on. Sure, it's not much, but it's at least something, given how underutilized he was in the main series. Shura, our main antagonist, is kinda meh. He wants to carry on Kaito's will of creating a world for the strong only, and that's about it. And you already know how I feel about the plot. It's fine, with no pacing issues or major plot issues. So yeah, that's about it for Gaim movies. Knuckle was a nice short story that focused on Zack. Kinda odd that all the movies Gaim had are pretty lackluster despite how good the TV series was. Oh well. Once again, we are ending this part with another important movie for the Rider franchise. Yes, the first movie war film, which is just called Movie War 2010, is probably the definition of a mixed bag. One part was awful, while the other part was completely amazing, and the last part also sucked. Let's start with the worst part, Final Chapter. This entire portion was pretty disappointing, pretty much scrapping the plot threads left by Decade's final episode and just going in a completely new direction. While there's nothing wrong with that, it's just that this new direction wasn't great at all. For some reason, Tsukasa decides to kill all the other Kamen Riders with Daiki, Natsumi, and Yusuke, don't even ask why he's sane again, eventually deciding to stop him. They kill him, but Tsukasa reveals this was all part of his plan before dying. Wataru explains that Tsukasa's battles with the other riders will somehow allow memories of each rider to last in people's memories, thus bringing all their worlds back. Decade has no storyline, then everyone remembers Tsukasa through a picture and he's magically back. Some stuff later and bam, evil's defeated. Yeah, you could probably tell that this movie didn't exactly have the clearest of directions. Made worse that this film also shoehorned a random subplot with Yuriko and how no one cares about her to try and have some connection with Tsukasa. Too bad this film apparently just forgets that Yuriko had Shigeru and the two of them were always considered a duo. Also, the conclusion of that subplot was a mess. Oh, thanks to Tsukasa doing nothing, I found the place where I belong, somehow. Final Chapter was just a giant mess, throwing around half-baked ideas into a giant mixing bowl to try and come up with some sensible conclusion for Decade. Well, given the development that this part went through, it's understandable why this part would turn out so badly, but that doesn't excuse its awful quality. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about probably the best portion to ever exist in a movie war, Begins Night. Honestly, if Begins Night was its own movie, it would probably be in the top 5. It's a fantastic origin story for both Shotaro and Philip. Despite being exclusive to the movie, not excluding Message per Skull, Sokichi is a fantastic character who was brilliantly written despite having such little screen time. We get to know all of these characters better, and this knowledge helps us understand them in the present. We see the stark contrast between their past and present selves. Shotaro's a lot more hot-headed while Philip is a lot more apathetic. We understand that Sokichi's death and the resulting guilt drives Shotaro to be better and causes him to refuse putting on his mentor's hat, as well as why he looks up to Sokichi so much. We learn why Philip fears Fang, why he desires to become more independent, and why he wants to stick with Shotaro. Hell, we even see some development for Shotaro in the present, being the first time where he's not relying on Sokichi's shadow to guide him, but instead working to become his own detective with his own ideals, symbolized by him standing against the ghost of Sokichi. An okay origin story is an origin story that only serves to tell a story and nothing more. A great origin story is a story that helps define the characters we love more and plays an impactful role in their development, which is exactly what Begins Night does. And the storytelling is honestly tight, constantly moving at a good pace. No scene really feels like padding or bloated with information. Honestly, the only real disappointment I have with this film is the villain, the dummy Dopant, being somewhat bland, but he really isn't the main focus of this film. And yeah, I could talk about the movie War 2010 portion where Decade and Double team up, but honestly all you really have to know is that it's the same quality as Final Chapter. Overall, Decade Final Chapter and Movie War 2010 are both messy, not really having any fleshed out ideas nor good developments for the cast, resulting in poor stories. However, Begins Night greatly makes up for it, serving as a great origin story for Shotaro and Philip, and paving the way for Shotaro's development in the present. Well, that's 3 parts done. One last one to go through. on how I can really only call 17 movies better than average. Well, we finally get to the movies I consider good. And up first is my second favorite Showa movie, Super 1 the movie. What makes this movie stand out from all the other Showa movies is that it's fun. Yeah, sure, you could apply that to the other Showa films, but I'd say that Super 1 the movie is one of the only Showa films that manages to balance telling a good story with a fun element. The main plot is really simplistic, with Kaze trying to stop Dogma from obtaining the weapon known as the Soaring Firing Machine, which is literally just a giant dragon flying ship. Now, like I hinted earlier, even though it's simplistic, this film still has depth to its narrative. Sure, it's not jaw-dropping quality with big defining moments for these characters, but it is better than what we got before. I like the movie's exclusive side characters because they actually felt like real important characters instead of faceless no-names that the film forces us to care about. We got to know their backstories and motivations. Even Super 1's main side cast got focus in this film. Sure, it's not much, but they actually felt useful. Plus, the fights never felt like they were dragged on or just there for the sake of having a fight. Each fight felt like it had a purpose behind it with a meaningful conclusion at the end of each one. However, even though this movie's a fun ride in my eyes, there are 3 detriments I have. One is that it doesn't really enhance the experience of Super 1. We don't learn about any of the characters we love or get to see them challenged in any meaningful way. But this is still an issue that doesn't really cause this movie's ratings to go down that much. The second is that there is a small story issue that sorta does make the actions of the characters questionable, but that's not really the biggest issue. The third and biggest issue I have is inserting the rest of the Showa writers in at the very end of this film. Why did they even need to be in this film? This was perfectly fine as just a solo film for Super 1. At least they don't take up too much screen time, unlike in 8 Riders vs. Galaxy King. So yeah, even though it's not the best story in the world, nor features the most emotional moments in Rider, Super 1 the movie is still a really fun film with a lot of good fight scenes and characters you can get invested in. Honestly, it's probably one of the most underrated films in my eyes. Well, we go from a film where I talk about everything they did good, to a film where I can only talk about what they did wrong. Yeah, I can really only rank Reiwa the first generation not for what it did good, but what for it did bad. The plot and pacing were great, but I just feel like this film was just pointless. None of the characters really got any meaningful expansion to them. Even though the Geocast is in this film, they basically do nothing, so it's really just a film focused on Naruto, and they really didn't do much with him. Like seriously, by the end of this film, what changes with him? His dream of creating a world with humans and Humagears is bolstered? He doesn't hate his father as much? We already know these things, so why bother having a film that tries to tell the audience these things? Like I stated before, the rest of the 01 cast and Geocast really do nothing, which just sucks in my opinion. Sogo is just there to be a reason why there's time travel in this film, and also be a quote-unquote mentor to Naruto, which only occurs once in the entire film. Izu is just there to reinforce the whole power of dreams message this film contains, and then the rest are just there for padding and cameos. I don't care about them in this film at all. Now we get to the more controversial points I have about this film. First up, as expected, are the villains. Finis is so bad as a villain. They want to rewrite history so Kamen Riders rule over the world because, hey guys, did you know that Kamen Riders were intended to be used as forces of evil? So that's why I have my plan, because it's symbolism. Alright. Doesn't explain anything else though. Plus, it doesn't help that they have no personality, no backstory, and how they got the power of Ichigo from Geo makes no sense. At least Will was slightly better, but not by much. Honestly, he could have been one of the better movie villains, but no, they squandered that chance. At first, he wants to have Humagears rebel against humans because he believes that Koronosuke and the others are just treating the Humagears as slaves. This would have been a really interesting motivation, as it would raise the question of, are Humagears just designed to benefit humans? But they didn't keep that motivation for him. Instead, he just reveals he wants to take over the world because, grr, humans bad, Humagear better, grr. What a wasted opportunity. Finally, and probably the most controversial point, Soryo. Yeah, I didn't like him. Well, I liked him in the beginning, but my love for him decreased as the film went on, especially at the very end. Sure, we learned that he created a bunch of the drivers, but the dude just felt like a dick. He acts oddly antagonistic for no reason, even making Naruto believe that he wants to destroy humans as it's the only way for Humagears to smile, but it actually turns out that he wants to protect both Humagears and humans to create a world where they can all smile together. Okay, why didn't you tell Naruto this as soon as possible, and instead wait until he firmly believed that you were going to kill all of humanity? And to make matters worse, he then tells Naruto to kill him because you won't be a real president until you do so. I'm like, what? Why? There is no reason for Soryo to do this. Oh, this is for the best. Oh, I wanted you to become your own president, not just living in the shadows of your predecessors. That doesn't even make sense. Yeah, I'm sure Aruto really wanted the mental trauma of ending his own father's wife, who was clearly saying to instead work with Aruto to take down the villains. I'm sure that was for the best. Also, what do you mean by becoming your own president? Aruto has never felt like he was just living in the shadows of his predecessor in this film, so why bother teaching him to grow out of that issue? And finally, why are you trying to teach Aruto that you need the strength to carry your dreams out alone, when the main point of 01 is that you can't achieve your dreams alone, but rather through the connections and bonds you made with others? This literally goes against 01's own theme. There are other story issues, but really that's everything I wanted to talk about to convey my feelings. Even though I've given this movie some shit, I still think this is a good movie, with good developments, character moments, and decent villains. Now we're out of the range of the 6 out of 10 movies, so up next is the first 7 out of 10 film. Fitting enough is the first film of the XIG trilogy, it's Brave and Snipe. Let me say this, it's really only ruined by the subplot of Nico and Luke, but I'll talk about that a bit later. Now, the plot and pacing are fine, with no major plot holes that ruin anything, though what brings it up is also the same thing that brings it down, the handling of the characters. Now, let me say that what I'm about to talk about may seem like a stretch, but it still makes sense to me. Hiro's my favorite character from the film, mainly because he finally gets a sense of closure. Sure, he already got his closure in the TV series, but I feel like it's different here. And here comes the stretch part. While the TV season did see Hiro move on from his past, that was more him prioritizing the present rather than the past. He was finally able to start trusting and prioritizing the people he has, instead of the people that are no longer with him. However, while he may have chosen to live in the present, it is only in this film that he can truly start living without regrets and guilt over his mistakes. With Taiga, while he doesn't get as nearly as much expansion as Hiro in this film, mainly just showcasing how he wants to make amends with Hiro, I still liked his handling. I like seeing how both of them were fellow soldiers tied by the same tragedy, and how both of them are trying to rectify the same issue so the other one doesn't have to. Hell, I even like Saki in this film. Sure, she doesn't really have a purpose other than to move the plot along, but I really loved how this film fleshed out the relationship between her and Hiro. It's really something that the main series neglected to do, as it's implied in the film that Saki was really the only person that Hiro connected with during his studies in college, which explains why Saki's death affected Hiro so heavily. Now with the other characters, they're a bit more hit and miss. Ren was pointless, and he really didn't do much, but I'm at least glad they brought back an already established villain rather than creating a new one for this film alone. Luke and Nico though, they're complete garbage. First off, Luke. He's just a creep. He just comes off as a really desperate dude that wants to date Nico for some dumb reason. Not help that he basically forces Nico to backtrack in her development. At the end of XIG, Nico was an adult who wanted to help others by being a doctor, but now she suddenly decides that she wants to play games instead because Luke showed me my true self. Like, what? I get they were trying to have Nico develop so that she could figure out what she really wants to do in life, but did it really have to be at the expense of her development and relationship with Taiga? Overall, this was a good movie. Hiro still remains my favorite character, and I like the closure he gets, even if it was a bit unnecessary, but hey. Taiga was alright, though I did find his character arc to be once again treading on old grounds. However, everyone else was decent or just terrible. Well, we go from a movie that I like for its characters to a movie that I like for its story. Yeah, Wizard and Magic Land is basically just like a better episode of Wizard. The movie doesn't really matter in the grand narrative of Wizard, but it still just tells a good story. I liked how this film basically spent the first half introducing us to the world where everyone knows magic, before transitioning into the latter half where we start getting into the whole Monster of the Week plot. This film never really felt like it dragged on or rushed anything. Now, the characters were honestly just kinda fine. Haruto just acts like he always does, which is good because I find him entertaining. Koyomi had an arc in this film, but it was mainly just warning that she'll be fine as long as Haruto's with her, which is decent, I guess. With the other characters, Emperor Maya was an okay character. I liked how he hated everyone because they shunned him for not being able to use magic, but I didn't really like how his arc ended. Instead of warning that wanting to kill all mages because they mocked him is wrong on his own, the film just flat out forced him to realize it. It isn't character development if you are forced to change none of your own free will. Shiina is a young boy, and that's all I'm going to say about him. He's honestly completely pointless to the entire plot, really only there to push the message of, your friends will help you through everything, which then got changed to trust who you believe in and don't regret it. Finally, we get to the villain, Orma, and he's kinda generic. He wants to rule over the world because he's a phantom, I guess. I mean, he's basically just a regular phantom that took his plan to 11. So yeah, that's really all I can say. The best thing about this film was how the film dealt with a new world where everyone can use magic. Everything else was just kinda okay or decent. This film wasn't average, but it wasn't completely amazing. Somewhere in between. Well, at this spot, we get to my favorite Showa film, and through the process of elimination, you already know what it is. Yeah, Kamen Rider J is, in my opinion, the most underrated film in the entire franchise. People keep talking about Zeto, but like, what about J? It's like 100 times better than that. The action is just as good, the characters are so much more interesting, the villains are just as cool as Doras, the music is also amazing. Like, how do people not talk about this movie more? Anyway, as you can tell, I think that the characters are so much better than Zeto and Shin's cast. Even within 44 minutes, Koji is a more fleshed out character than both Masaru and Shin. He's a photographer that cares for nature, with a nice big brother vibe to him, but he can be a bit reckless at times. Compare that to Masaru and Shin, where the only thing they got was being a lab rat to the professor they respected. With the other characters, there were really only two of them, Barry and Kana. However, thankfully, neither of them really appeared much, so time wasn't really wasted on them. Finally, the villains. Good lord, they are really good. Unlike the Neo-organism who wanted to kill humans because God complex, the Fog wanted to devour humans so that they could provide food for their race. Sure, it's a simple motivation for evil, but it goes a long way making these villains have depth and making them understandable. And with the story, similar to Super 1 the movie, it's just a fun ride all around. The plot moves at a decent pace with no big story issues, everything is explained so that the viewer knows what's going on from the start, looking at you Zeto, and the fights and set design are simply amazing. Sure, I could say that the villains could have been more memorable, the story could have been more complex, and Koji could have had more stuff to him to flesh in Mao's character, but for a film that's only 44 minutes long, I'd say what we got was pretty great. So overall, I think J is a great film that manages to balance action, plot, and character extremely well, especially for a Showa film. Can you tell that I'm a big J defender?
This film is probably one of the biggest comebacks that a series has ever had.
Yeah, Gay's Majesty is simply great. I know, I was completely shocked too. Heisei Generations Forever and Over Quarters were such bad movies that I didn't think that Geo could get better, and then came Gay's Majesty and oh man, it blew all expectations out of the water. Now, Gaze was simply a great character in this film, except there's a caveat, that being that the film technically doesn't focus on Gaze, but rather Gaitsu. To briefly explain, he is not the same Gaze as the one from the TV series, but the alternate universe version who was created after Soga resetted the timeline at the end of Geo. While this does disappoint me, it doesn't disappoint me that much. And yes, I know he regains his memories, but by that time, the film is almost over. Anyway, I love Gaze's development in this film, going from someone who's lost his dream to figuring out what he wants to do in life. Funny how in 30 minutes, Gaze is developed more as a character than in 49 25-minute episodes. With that aside, there's really not much else I can say about Gaze other than his development's great, so let's move on to the other characters. They're all fine. The Legend Riders and the rest of the Geo crew were nice to see, but it's very clear that they didn't really contribute to the plot at all. Speaking of the plot, it was decent? The ending felt rushed, but I liked the overall story. Sure, there are some plot holes, such as how the Legend Riders are in Geo's world when the ending literally separated each season into its own world, but hey, pretty much every season afterwards has disregarded Geo's finale, so why not? Also, Oma Geo somehow exists even though he shouldn't exist, so... Though what brings it down is probably obvious since I haven't talked about them yet. The villain, White Waz from another world. Yeah, he's quite bad. He wants to become a savior by absorbing Gabe's power because, I don't know, thematics? Also, he survived because he managed to escape the destruction of his another world. Okay, how? So yeah, another film that I can't really say much about other than it's great. I love Gaze's development and the interactions between the characters, but it's brought down by White Waz, Gatesu being developed and not Gaze, and some off-story beats. Well, once again, we got a movie that does wonders expanding a character, despite my initial prejudice towards it. Yeah, All Riders vs. Dice Shocker was a lot better than I was expecting. I mean, it had elements of things I've hated in worse films. Riders fighting between each other, Shocker coming back, and introducing random characters out of left field, but this movie somehow made it work. Well, it's the only movie that made it work, and even then, it's still not that amazing. Anyways, like I hinted in the introduction, this movie really helped to define Tsukasa as a character. I mean, he was always someone with swagger and personality, but he feels more complete. Sure, his goal of finding his own world hasn't changed, but now it's gained more meaning, since he's not searching for his own world, but a world that he can call his home. He also gets a lot of his backstory revealed in this film. He was actually the leader of Die Shocker, joining it because he believed that killing all the riders would stop the destruction of all the worlds.
He also probably reaches his lowest in his life. After the revelations about his past and his selfish actions jeopardizing his own friend's safety, he's abandoned by everyone and left with nothing. But after a pep talk, he realizes that he needs to atone for his sins by fighting against Daishocker and to protect the people he still cares about, even if they don't care about him. Honestly, this film really made me love Tsukasa even more. The other characters, however, well, they don't get as much focus as Tsukasa did. Honestly, they performed their roles well, adding to the drama and story when necessary, but they didn't really do much other than that, which is a shame since I would have loved to see more. Saya was the movie exclusive character, and she's revealed to be Tsukasa's sister, who has always had a grudge against Tsukasa for basically abandoning her because he wanted to go on journeys. Though, she eventually makes up with Tsukasa, while also warning that she needs to be able to stand on her own without constantly being babied. Yeah, her arc was good, but I ultimately found she was pointless in the end. I honestly would have liked her to be removed so that we could have more time focusing on Tsukasa being a part of Daishocker or his redemption. The plot, like I hinted, was pretty good. The Rider tournament actually had a purpose in the grand narrative, and I liked the reasoning for why everyone joined, so they could determine the strongest Rider to stop the worlds from all being destroyed. And even though I would have preferred Saya be removed from the film, I liked how she at least impacted Tsukasa. Sure, there are some story hiccups, such as how Tsukasa joined Daishocker in the first place never being explained, but for an anniversary film, I might as well give it some slack because anniversary films too tend to have more story issues. And villains, yeah, I still don't like them. Honestly, whenever Shocker comes back for a film, just assume they're one of the worst parts of the film. They want to take over all the worlds because they're evil. They do also have a commander in the form of Nobuhiko, who's the butler of Tsukasa and Sayo, and he's Shadow Moon. Yeah, this dude is just here for fan service and nothing else. Despite that, this film was great. Tsukasa had a really good expansion to his character in this film, and honestly, I think he was at his best in this film. Everyone else was either useless or were good, but felt unnecessary in the grand scheme of things, and as expected, the villains were terrible. Though the story was fine, with nothing really feeling like it was pointless. Well, we're reaching the top 10, and fitting enough, we now have the films I would rate an 8 out of 10. Starting off this last 10 is Paradox with Poppy. This is basically Brave and Snipe without any of the dumb Luke and Nico quality subplot included. Paruto got as good of an expansion as Hiro did in the first film, basically warning the importance of heart. Sure, by the end of the series, Paruto understood the value of lives, but not the value of heart. With Poppy though, she wasn't good but not bad either. She was really just there to give backstory in Masamune and reaffirm the belief that Bugsters and humans can coexist. However, she's still a fine character in this film. Plus, the film actually does stand out from the rest because it actually has a good villain. Black Paruto is the Bugster of Masamune, and he's basically just Paruto from the very start of the series, but more cold. Sure, he is kind of bland, not really having much of a personality other than ruthless, but I think it works to serve the story. Paruto is essentially fighting his own past self in this film, one that doesn't care for humans and only cares about his own victory. Yet Paruto managed the best Black Paruto, and by extension his own past self, showing how strong his development has made him. We also have Sayako. Sure, she was in Brave and Snipe, but she didn't really stand out until this film, where we learn a lot about her. It turns out that she's the daughter of Michiko Saisen, the villain from Heisei Generations, and she wants to kill all Bugsters because she wants revenge for them killing her father. Sure, it's a simple motivation, but like I said for the Fog, it goes a long way to make her a great villain. And the story is quite great. Sure, the beginning of the film can feel like it's just there for padding, but honestly, I felt it set the tone of the film pretty well. Overall, a great film that has good villains that serve the story, great developments for the focus characters, and had a great story that wasn't bogged down by any stupid subplots that caused characters to reverse in their developments. Up next, we got another film that I feel is quite a bit underrated. While the common consensus is that Movie War Full Throttle is good, I feel like most people don't really talk about this film when discussing the best movie war films. Well, I'm here to try and change that by saying that Full Throttle is not only one of the best movie war films, but also one of the best films in general. Between the two portions, I'd say that Gaim's is definitely the weaker one. They basically repeated Mitsuzane's redemption arc from the finale and also didn't really focus on Takatora at all in this film. However, I will acknowledge that they at least tried to develop these characters a bit more, and I do understand wanting to focus on Mitsuzane since his redemption was a bit rushed. There were also some things that weren't as strong as they could have been, namely some weird story points, such as Ryoma deciding to be a part of MegaHex when the dude has never bowed down to those stronger than him, Mitsuzane having another Sengoku driver for no reason, and Kota getting revived because Kiwami bullshit. The second part is MegaHex, who is some alien robot that wants to synthesize everything into one being because harmony and being a part of the system is good. While he wasn't bad, he was certainly bland. However, he does make up for it with his philosophy going against the characters of this film. Now onto the better part, the challenge from Lupin. What makes it better is the development that Shinosuke gets over the course of this portion. After losing Krim, he starts feeling lost, believing he can't do anything on his own. However, thanks to the shift cars, he finds out that he doesn't need to have Krim nor the ability to transform to be amazing on his own, which is an element that wouldn't really get touched again until the finale. Now, the other characters don't really do much, but they do at least serve the story in a decent way, so I won't talk about them and instead just move on to the villain of this part, Lupin, otherwise known as Zoroku. Zoroku is interesting to say the least. It turns out he's actually the cyborg known as ZZZ, which was intended to be Krim's original body, but since Krim didn't have the fortitude to fuse with it, he decided to hide it away and become the drive driver instead. Anyways, Zoroku managed to find it and fuse with it. Now his backstory is fine and all, but it's his motivation for being a villain that makes him weird. He ultimately wants to replace Shinosuke as a true hero because he's angry that Shinosuke is just a naive greenhorn and Krim has been turned into a stat belt? What? Okay, but how does this explain you trying to steal things in a grandiose way? Zoroku isn't bad, but funny enough, I think he's a worse villain compared to the literal robot that has no personality. And finally, we have the team-up portion between the two writers, and honestly, it's probably the greatest final section of a movie war film. Shinosuke and Kota play off of each other really well, and seeing them interact was great. I honestly wish this section was longer, or other movie war sections managed to have the same quality as this one, since I really loved it. Overall, this was a great film. Sure, it didn't really do much for the Gaim cast, had mediocre villains, and some plot holes here and there, but I still liked it. Plus, Drive's portion really made up for the lackluster Gaim portion, though it's because of those reasons that it's not getting any higher. Well, we got another winter film, and it's one you'd probably expect to rank this high. Yeah, Heisei Generation's final is a much better film than its predecessor. There's really only one thing about this film that I really dislike. That is the villain, Kaisei Mogami. Sure, his gimmick was interesting. There are essentially two alternate versions of him, one from Build's world and one from X8's world. Heisei Mogami is honestly pointless. We barely knew anything about the dude, and it felt like he was only there because we gotta have something to connect with two worlds colliding. At least Build Mogami was more interesting, but he was also just bland and cliched. At first, he was a researcher that discovered the existence of parallel worlds, attempting to get to those other worlds, but the Toto government wouldn't fund him, so he left to join Namba and created the Kaiser system. His ultimate goal is to become immortal and rule over every parallel world because he's insane, I guess. To do this, he must fuse both Build's and X8's world alongside his alternate self to become by Kaiser. Okay, but how does this grant you immortality? The other elements though, while I liked them, they weren't really the best it could have been. The story was fine, though there were some issues I had with them. Emu and Sento really didn't do much at all in the film, and while seeing the Legend Riders all return again was amazing, I will admit I did think there could have been more to them than what we saw. So if I'm saying most of everything was average, why does this film rank so high? Well, it's mainly because of Ryuga. His development over the course of this film was quite frankly great. Through the efforts and advice of the other Legend Riders, he learns what it means to be a Kamen Rider, to fight for everyone no matter what. There is only one tiny issue that I have with it though. Shouldn't he already know that he wants to fight for everyone since, well, when he first transformed into Karasi, he stated that he would listen to Kasumi's wishes to fight for others. But I'm nitpicking here. I really do love how the Legend Riders played a role in Ryuga's development, making them actually feel meaningful to the story. It's why I find this a much better film than Heisei Generations. We only have to deal with one, technically two, villains. There are no random movie exclusive characters that we have to care about for this film only, and the Legend Riders actually pass down advice to the newer writers in this film. Overall, this film is great. It adds some great development for Ryuga, stellar moments from the rest of the cast, and a fun and intriguing plot, though there are still some hiccups along the way. We're entering the last 7 now, and it's time for the films that are rated 9 out of 10. First up is Drive Summer Film, Surprise Future. Now, this film was excellent, really only brought down by a few minute nitpicks I have in this film, and you can probably guess one of them. Yeah, it's the villain, the Paradox Roidmude. While he does have an interesting backstory, namely impersonating Shinosuke's future son, Eiji, and coming back in time, honestly, his entire character was pretty bland. He just wants to take over the world because he's evil. The other nitpick I have is something that probably sounds really petty, but Shinosuke didn't really develop as much as I'd hope. Yes, he lost Krim again in this film, but really, how does losing Krim affect him in this film? He goes through some turmoil and grief, but does he change or grow by the end of this film? Not really. That's not to say I didn't like seeing the struggles of Shinosuke in this film. In my opinion, Drive is probably the best series in terms of drama, and Surprise Future really goes hard with it here. The moment when Shinosuke visits Krim's original drive pit and that entire sequence, God, it's so good. Oh yeah, do you guys remember how I said that Genesis ruined one of the most emotional moments of Surprise Future? Well, I was referring to the fact that the key moment of this film was that the day the film takes place, August 8th, was the 1-year anniversary of when Shinosuke and Krim met for the first time, with Krim giving Shinosuke access to the original drive pit as a gift. So when Genesis retcons Krim's first meeting with Shinosuke to actually occur back in 2005, it kind of leaves a sour note. Well, Genesis is non-canon though, except maybe not for Drive, so that does mitigate it a bit. While I do love how this film showcases the relationship between Shinosuke and Krim, it does lead to a bit of a miss in my opinion, which are the roles of Go and Chase in this film. I'm glad that they don't take up too much screen time in this film, since there was no reason to shove them in, but as a result, they feel forgotten about in this film. Overall, this was a great film, with some excellent drama, nice story pacing, and good characterization, but the lack of substantial character development and a lackluster villain means that it doesn't rank any higher. Yes, you could say this film didn't need to have a good villain, since it was more focused on the relationship between Krim and Shinosuke, but I still felt that even that aspect wasn't as strong as it could have been. Still though, an excellent film. Another summer film, and another film penned by Riku Sanjo. You all know what it is. Yeah, Double Forever is also simply amazing. While Shotaro was a huge badass in this film, even transforming into Joker and kicking ass solo, it's Philip who I felt was the best part about this film. His entire arc with believing Maria is his mother, and that hope to finally learn more about his past, led to a lot of great character moments and conflicts that really helped Philip grow as a person. Hell, this is the first time where Philip starts to judge the situation not through logic and facts, but through his own feelings, which is not only a stark contrast to how he was in the beginning, but makes for a nice reversal in this film, since Shotaro's the one who starts using logic to assess the situation at hand. And though I don't say much about the action, I really have to give credit to Koichi Sakamoto for making the fight scene simply amazing to watch, especially that final fight. It really feels like a grand finale with everything at stake. And the story itself was just as good as the characters in this film. The plot moved at a wonderful pace, with nothing feeling rushed or dragged on, and the twists and reveals were amazing, not feeling too obvious, but at the same time, there were enough clues for someone to piece the puzzle together on their own. Plus, I love the focus on Philip and Shotaro's relationship in this film, really testing the pair at one of their lowest points, but showing they'll still be there for each other no matter what. Now, there's one element I haven't talked about, and well, now that I've mentioned it, you're probably going to hate my opinion. I think the villains are pretty bad. Don't get me wrong, Katsumi is a really cool and badass character, but the dude is literally just like Gao with a fresh coat of paint. He does his job as a villain well, his plan was reasonable, but his characterization and motivation was just non-existent. Seriously, other than being batshit insane, what else did he really have to him that made him interesting as a character? I mean, we've had plenty of villains that were just insane before Katsumi. What does one more really add on? And as I've hinted in my section for Double Returns Eternal, his motivation didn't make sense to me. He wants to turn everyone into necro-overs because he doesn't want to feel alone? Okay, but if that's true, why would you then kill your fellow necro-over comrades? And I don't believe it's simply because of Gaia memory corruption, because the dude has never used the Gaia memory on himself before. Plus, he fully knows that there needs to be a serum to constantly keep all the necro-overs alive, so, by turning an entire city into necro-overs, you are going to eventually run out of that serum to keep everyone alive. Why would you want to turn everyone into necro-overs if you don't want to feel alone, without ensuring they would stay alive for more than a couple of days? And the rest of the Never crew are also just as bland as Katsumi. They all have one trait defining them and are just there to match 4 of Double Sky's memories. But there is one character I'm forgetting to mention, and I'm going to come in with another hot take. Maria S. Cranberry is Katsumi's mother, and I'm 100% serious when I say that she is a better character and villain than Katsumi. We warned that her grief over losing a young Katsumi drove her to revive him as a necro-over, and do anything to ensure her son remains happy, but after meeting Philip, she realizes that what she's done is wrong and goes against her own son, resulting in her death. Yeah, compare that to Katsumi, who wanted to kill humans because he's insane. Sure, Katsumi may be the more memorable villain of the two, but just because you are more memorable doesn't mean you are better. Overall though, this was a fantastic movie, having a great focus on the relationship between Shotaro and Philip and giving great development / moments for Philip. The story was great, the action was also great, and the villains were serviceable. Well, instead of this film having the same writer as the previous film, it's the director that's the same for the previous film. And you can probably guess which one this is. Everyone's Spaces here is honestly just as good as Double Forever, though there are a few things that made this movie place above it. While the characters didn't really go through much changes or developments, the entire story and drama is what made this film really stand out.
From watching the Kamen Rider Club go through hijinks to prepare for space, the scene where 40 of Gintaro's friends switch on the astro switches to help him in battle, the speech Gintaro makes, and many more scenes really make this one of the funnest movies to watch, while also being one of the movies that really drag you into the stakes. What I'm trying to say is that this movie really makes you emotionally invested in everything, which is great because it just makes me care about the struggles everyone goes through in this film. And as I've hinted at before, like Double Forever, this film also combines great emotional beats with amazing action thanks to Koichi Sakamoto's direction. But now, we get to the 3 nitpicks I have with this film that prevent it from reaching any higher. First up is the character of Inga Blink. While she is a complete badass, I found her characterization could have had a bit more work, since all we really know about her is that she wants revenge against the villains for killing her father. Plus, the fact that she was really only there to exist as both red herring and pointless plot dump doesn't really make her any better. We also have the villains, as expected. The Tetsujin are honestly quite weak. They're sentient machines that want to enslave Earth because they're evil? However, what makes them even worse is something that I covered way back when I talked about Ultimatum. That is, they took old heroes and deliberately turned them into villains just for the sake of advertising and fan service. What's worse is that one of the original villains from that series was reimagined as an ally for this film. Yeah, imagine if Kamen Rider in 20 years made a film where they just took the Go Rangers and rebooted them into the villain and made the Black Cross Fear's modern incarnation an ally, all for the sake of fan service. Would it be cool? Maybe. Would it be respectful? Not really. And the last point I want to make is actually focus on Gintaro. While I will always regard him as a great Kamen Rider character, he already acts really hypocritical in this film. To make it even worse, the dude believes he can befriend a weapon that at the time he believes has no sentience whatsoever and can change it, but then he believes that the Tetsujin, 2 clearly sentient machine beings, can't change and therefore must be destroyed. Like, why? I'm pretty sure the Tetsujin are the only villains that Gintaro has never attempted to befriend, forgive, or reason with. Hell, Gintaro even managed to convince Gamo to change, who was the mastermind behind everything. It's hypocritical for Gintaro to believe that XV2 can change, but neither of the Tetsujin. However, that is all just a nitpick, though it's because of those issues that it doesn't rank any higher. When comparing this film to Double Forever, while Double Forever has the better character arc that fits the overall narrative, story, and villain compared to this movie, I find this film had more emotional investment for me. Though honestly, those 2 films' rankings can swap depending on how I feel about it. They're both that good. Overall, just a really great film that has some flaws, but none that detract from the fun in a big way. We're at the last 4, and this time they're all ranked a 10 out of 10. Kinda. This one is like a 9.9 out of 10, but I only use whole numbers, so it rounds up. Yeah, well, Megamax is a very, very great film. There are some slight issues I have with it that cause it to be the lowest of the 10 out of 10 films. Don't get me wrong, I would absolutely recommend this film to everyone and say it is a near flawless film, but there are some things that prevent me from saying that it is a flawless film. With Oz's portion, I loved how it followed up on the ending of Oz, seeing AG and Ankh reunite and continuing both the story and character arcs each of them had in a meaningful way, namely AG being more motivated to restore Ankh as he knows that Ankh will be revived. However, while I did like Mikkel in his arc, basically becoming a courageous hero, I kinda wish he wasn't in the film so we could instead solely focus on AG and Ankh, but since I like Mikkel, it doesn't bug me as much. Next up is Forzei's portion, and it was better than Oz, since it gave some development to Gintaro by giving him a love interest. Now, I know giving someone a love interest to force a development is a very old trope, but I like the way it was handled here. Gintaro learned to be more honest with his feelings toward his friends, plus, seeing him with Nadeshiko was kinda cute. Oh yeah, Nadeshiko. She's also like Mikkel, but a bit better. She's an alien who turns out to be an SLLU. She's not human, and really only copies things she sees, but thanks to her interactions with Gintaro, she gains sentience. Overall, a really nice arc to pair with Gintaro's own. Plus, the story flowed fine, with a lot of fun moments and, like always, some really good emotional moments. Finally, we get to the team-up part, which is amazing. Not only do we get to see Gintaro and AG team up, but we also get to see Shotaro and Philip appear as well. Hell, we even get a reference to Double Forever in one of these interactions. Plus, I loved how Oz's and Forzei's portion flowed together into the final part. It really felt like a finale that was built up, rather than being shoved in at the last minute. Speaking of returning actors, we do also see the return of the 7 legendary riders, and in a way that shows them kicking serious ass, which is always a bonus in my eyes. However, here's why I call this the worst of the 10 out of 10 films. Which are the villains? Poseidon wants to kill Oz because he's evil. Lemka Nagi wants to take over the world's energy and rule over humanity because he's also evil. Yeah, no matter how good your story is, if your villains suck, you aren't gonna rate highly in my eyes. Overall, a near perfect movie. Oz's portion was a nice epilogue and continued the story of Oz by giving it a more happy ending, while Forzei's portion gave good development to Gintaro.
The villains, while weak, did their job, and I love seeing Shotaro, Philp, and the 7 legendary riders again. Plus, the story and pacing, as I've said many times, was amazing. As I've hinted with Megamax, these next 3 films are all films I would consider perfect. The only reason why I would rank one above the other is simply because I like one more than the other. The first of the perfect films is probably one that none of you guys were expecting. Drive Saga Chaser is an amazing movie that focuses on Chase in a brilliant way. It challenges him in a way that would naturally create strife in his character. His entire shtick was being socially awkward because he simply didn't understand human norms, nor could express emotions, so what better way to challenge him than by giving them the one thing he's wanted, the ability to express emotions. As a side note, to make sure none of you guys are confused by the things I say later down the line, the villain implants feathers into beings that will fill them with emotions at the cost of slowly sapping their free will away. Anyways, as the film progresses, he struggles to relinquish his newfound emotions since he fears people will come to dislike him for not being human anymore, but after realizing that his desire to be more human has endangered people, he decides to get rid of his emotions so he can protect the people he cares about. Honestly, his character arc gave him a development unmatched by any movie before it, and it really shows Chase in a good light. No matter what, he will always protect his friends, even if it means he must sacrifice a part of himself. Plus, the subplot of the film complemented Chase's arc extremely well. Hiroshi is a meek boy who initially distrusts Chase due to him not being human, which is the impetus for Chase wanting to gain emotions in the first place. Once Chase gains his emotion, the two of them bond really well, furthering Chase's desire to not give up his emotions since it's the first time he's able to help someone not as a Kamen Rider, but as a human being. As their relationship deepens, Hiroshi reveals himself to be an introvert who hates not being able to open up to others, which is why when Hiroshi is given the chance to become more extroverted by gaining a feather, and the only way for Chase to save him is to rip out his own feather, Chase does so for reasons I explained earlier. While Hiroshi's own development was great to watch and mirrored Chase's extremely well, the ending of the subplot also deserves praise, as it shows that just because Chase can't express himself as a human, that doesn't mean he can't help others and inspire them to change just by being himself. And finally, we have an amazing villain to drive the story. Angel is an over-evolved Roibu who, like I've stated earlier, can implant feathers into any being to fill them with emotions, at the cost of slowly sapping their free will and turning them into puppets which Angel can control. While her characterization was decent, mainly just being a psychotic bitch in sheep's disguise, her motivation for her plan was actually great. She wants to control Roidmutes not because she's evil, but because she genuinely believes that this will help everyone, as if everyone is content with their life, then no one will want to do anything, and thus, there will be no strife or conflict in the world. Her intentions were noble, it's just the methods she used to achieve it were not. Plus, the story itself was fantastic. While Chase and Hiroshi's arc bump up the narrative a lot, there were a lot of small scenes that really make this a great film to watch. From the small scenes we get between Chase, Brain, and Heart, a small expansion on Chase's backstory, as well as some fun comedy moments, there are simply a lot of other things that I didn't mention that really enhance the quality of this film. If there is a nitpick I can make about this film, it is mainly the scenes involving Ryu, as they were really just disconnected with the overall plot. But it's fine, as they were still enjoyable to watch. Overall, a really great movie with excellent development and expansion on Chase as a character, showing that while he may want emotions, he'll still choose to protect others. Angel as a villain was really well done. Her character and motivation weren't bland, which already puts her above most movie villains. The story fit well in the overall story of Drive, explaining what we never see or hear about this movie past episode 41, and I did like the more emotional parts and slower pace, since that's what the movie was going for. Our runner-up for the best Kamen Rider film is the conclusion to the greatest trilogy of Kamen Rider films, Gem vs. Laser. This might be the X8 fanboy inside of me, but I really fucking love this movie. It is one of the only times where I actually started tearing up, which is not an easy feat. Hell, the only other scene that has made me tear up before was the letter speech from Forze's finale. Now, the story itself was amazing. While it was certainly fast-paced, that's mainly attributed to being the finale of the Another Ending trilogy. And this did certainly feel like a finale to a trilogy. Everything the past two films were building up culminated in a fantastic story and film. There's really not much else I can say about the story other than it is amazing and definitely requires watching both Brave and Snipe and Paradox with Poppy to get the full experience. Kiryu himself was good, but I feel like he was more there as a mirror to Kuroto in his arc. And the other characters, while not really doing much, I still feel like had a nice payoff to their own arcs, especially Saiko and Masamune. But now, we get to the character who single-handedly made this movie rank so high, Kuroto Dan. Now, to be clear, while Kuroto isn't one of my favorite characters in Rider, this film makes him place pretty high up for simply how much the scope goes in unraveling the complexity of his character. Now, this is a lot of interpretation on my part, but to me, this just makes his character a lot more complex, tragic, and sympathetic. His goal is to essentially put the entire world through a game known as Zombie Chronicle, forcing the players to fight against zombie gamers, though if they manage to defeat one, a victim of the bug survivors will come back. At the end of the film, it's hinted that Kuroto only enacted this plan as a test for humanity, mainly to see if his way is truly correct. If he is unable to be beaten, then it shows that humanity cannot overcome him, and thus his intellect and knowledge is still required. However, if he can be beaten, then the safety of humanity's future will be ensured, and he will no longer be needed for his intellect. Kuroto truly does want to save humanity, but his distrust in the world and their abilities make him test them first to see if they're truly capable of achieving his goal, since his distrust stems from the hospital and by extension the world's inability to save his mother. But thanks to Kiryu defeating him, Kuroto realizes that he can entrust the lives of everyone to Kiryu and the others and passes on, even giving Kiryu the key to reviving bugsters as humans in the form of the God Maximum Mighty XIG Shot. Honestly, Kuroto is just such a great character in this film, and his arc is something that really carries this movie hard. There's really not much else I can say about this film other than you should watch it solely for Kuroto. Sure, you may be wondering why despite praising a lot fewer aspects of the film compared to Drive Saga Chaser, this movie still ranks higher, but that's simply because I found Kuroto a much better of a character and villain compared to Angel, and the film had more memorable moments for me. By process of elimination, you already know what number 1 is going to be, so I'm not going to keep you waiting. Yes, this might be the cliche choice for Best Writer film, but it's well deserved. Paradise Lost is an exceptional film that simply does everything right. The characters are amazing and given great expansion, the story is tight with no scenes feeling dragged on or rushed, the villain is amazing and probably the best movie villain to date, and the action is stunning, with probably some of the most striking scenes in a film to date. Starting off with the action, I think this film has some of the best action in a Rider film to date. From the fight between Kaisa and Saiga, to Phase and Saiga, and the final showdown between Takumi and Kiba, there are just so many great scenes that have stuck with me, and the final Rider kick of the film is simply the best finale finisher to a film to date. To add on, none of the fights really felt forced, with each one having a clear purpose. The story is great. Even though this is an alternate universe, I feel like this film really fleshes out this universe extremely well. The world building is fantastic, and the alternate universe scenario really does feel like it impacts the story, compared to films such as Kabuto, Blade, or Ryuki, where the alternate universe scenario barely has an impact. Plus, like I've mentioned before, there aren't really any pacing issues I have with this movie. The beginning of the film does an excellent job introducing the viewer to this new universe, and the pacing changes with respect to the story. It goes fast when it needs to go fast, and it goes slow when it needs to go slow. And the characters, good god were they great. While Takumi, Maru, Kusaka, and Keitaro didn't really develop much, they still all got their moments to shine, and they acted pretty much like they did in the TV series, which is great. From Takumi accepting himself as the savior of this world, to Keitaro getting the courage to stand up for himself, or Ueo just being the best, each of these characters felt like they were written to be at their best, and then went beyond that. Hell, even the new characters felt like well-established characters. I've already mentioned Ueo, who is great for reasons you already know. Mizuhara was a great secondary antagonist, being hot-headed and reckless who hates all Orphanox, which actually leads to his own avoidable death. Mina is really the only exception to this rule, since she was really just there to have a pointless love triangle because, in a way. But at least she doesn't take up too much screen time. Though now, we get to the greatest character to ever exist in a Kamen Rider film, Yuji Kiba. Yeah, what they did to him was brutal, but my god, he still remains one of my most beloved characters. While Kaido and Yuka were alright, they were nothing compared to what Kiba got in this film. He still retains his dream that Orphanox and humans can coexist, but after betrayal, his conviction finally cracks, resulting in probably one of the saddest scenes in Kamen Rider. Just watching him lament and scream out over wondering what he's been fighting for all this time after watching both of his friends die and believing that Mari's betrayed him simply because she doesn't believe Orphanox can exist with humans is just heartbreaking. But it's because of this that he fully accepts being an Orphanox and becomes Orca, dueling with Takumi in one of the most epic fight scenes. However, after discovering that Takumi, despite being an Orphanox, fights for humanity and coming to the realization that the Mari who betrayed him was a fake, he sacrifices himself, telling Takumi and Mari to carry on his dream to create a world where everyone can coexist. Honestly, I could go on and on about this film for how great it is, but hopefully you can see why I find this film to be the best Rider film to date. An amazing story that has excellent pacing and filled to the brim with drama, the action is outstanding, the characters felt well utilized and had small developments, the new characters felt well fleshed out, and Kiba comes out as my favorite Kamen Rider movie villain and character to exist. Well, this has certainly been a long road, but thank you all for watching this 4-part series. I'm Kamisata RX, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Till next time.